Of course, here are a few options for an engaging intro, each with a slightly different focus. Hashtag option 1. Focus on the decision. For the Miller family, their coastal home was a fortress built against the world. But as a monster hurricane gathers on the horizon, the walls are about to be tested, not just by the wind and waves, but by a single, fateful decision that will pit a husband's faith in his own hands against a force of unimaginable power. Hashtag option 2. Focus on the theme. Some storms tear down houses. Others tear down a person's entire world. For David Miller, a man who believed his own two hands could protect his family from anything, a hurricane named Helena is about to deliver a brutal lesson. When the ocean comes to reclaim the shore, the only shelter that can truly hold is the one you cannot see. Hashtag option 3. Short and punchy. David Miller trusted in the solid logic of wood and nails. His wife, Sarah, listened to the uneasy whispers of her soul. As a killer hurricane barrels toward their home, they're about to discover which is stronger, with their children's lives hanging in the balance. Hashtag chapter 1. The gathering gloom. The sky over Havens Point had always been a thing of beauty, a vast, benevolent canvas upon which the sun painted its daily masterpieces of dawn and dusk. For David and Sarah Miller, it was one of the reasons they'd moved here, away from the concrete canyons and incessant hum of the city. They wanted their children, 10-year-old Leo and 6-year-old Maya, to grow up under an open sky, to know the scent of salt on the wind and the feel of sand between their toes. Their house, a sturdy, 2-story clapboard structure painted a cheerful seafoam green, stood on a gentle rise a quarter-mile from the shore. It was their sanctuary, their fortress, their home. That Tuesday began like any other August day in the coastal Carolinas, thick with a humidity you could wear like a second skin. David had been on the porch since sunrise, a mug of coffee steaming in his hands, watching the gulls circle over the placid, gray-blue water. He was a practical man, a carpenter by trade, with hands that were calloused and capable. He understood the world through the logic of wood and nails, of stress points and load-bearing walls. He had built the wide, welcoming porch himself, and he knew every joint and beam was secure. Sarah found him there, her presence a soft counterpoint to his solid frame. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch light and familiar. "The weather report is getting serious," she said, her voice a low hum of concern. "They're calling her Helena. Category 3, they said, and strengthening." David grunted, taking a slow sip of coffee. "They always say that. It'll veer east, they always do. We'll get some rain, a bit of a blow. Nothing this old house can't handle." He had a deep-seated faith in the things he could see and touch, in the strength of the joists he had measured and cut himself. But Sarah's faith was anchored in the unseen. She looked past the calm water, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the sky was beginning to take on a strange, bruised quality, a subtle shift from azure to a hazy, yellowish gray. An unease, cold and sharp, pricked at her spirit. It was a feeling she had learned to trust, a quiet whisper in her soul that served as her compass. "I don't know, David. This feels different." Inside, the children were oblivious. Leo was meticulously constructing a complex castle of interlocking plastic bricks on the living room floor, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was his father's son in his attention to detail, but he had his mother's sensitivity. Storms made him anxious. The unpredictable roar of the wind and the percussive crack of thunder seemed to violate the orderly world he tried so hard to build. Maya, on the other hand, was a creature of pure light. She was dancing in a sunbeam that slanted through the window, her pigtails flying as she hummed a tuneless song to her collection of stuffed animals arranged in a solemn circle. For her, the world was a place of uncomplicated wonder, and a storm was just another kind of weather, as natural as sunshine. By midday, the signs were no longer subtle. The air grew heavy and still, charged with an electric tension. The usual chorus of cicadas and birds fell silent, a profound and unnatural hush that was more alarming than any noise. The sky had curdled into a menacing swirl of gray and a sickly, greenish-black. The local news channel had abandoned all other programming. A permanent red banner at the bottom of the screen. Hurricane Helena. Mandatory evacuation for coastal zones A and B. Their home was in Zone B. "We should pack a few things," Sarah said, her voice tight. "Just in case. We can go to my sister's in Raleigh." David stood up, the legs of his chair scraping against the porch decking. He stared out at the ocean, which was no longer placid. The water had turned choppy and resentful, a metallic gray flecked with white. The wind was beginning to stir, a low, mournful moan that snaked through the long grasses of the dunes. "It's too late," he said, his voice grim. "Look at the traffic on the causeway. It's a parking lot. We'd be trapped on that bridge if the storm surge came early. We're safer here. We'll board up and ride it out." His decision was made, and Sarah, despite her own deep misgivings, knew better than to argue when he used that tone. He was the protector, the shield of their family. His confidence, rooted in the tangible world of hurricane shutters and backup generators, was a bulwark she wanted desperately to believe in. The next few hours were a blur of frantic activity. David, his face a mask of grim determination, hauled the sheets of plywood from the garage. The rhythmic thud of his hammer against the nails was a frantic heartbeat, a declaration of war against the approaching storm. Leo, trying to be helpful, followed his father around, handing him nails and screws, his young face pale with a fear he tried to hide. He kept glancing at the sky, his eyes wide, as if he could see the monster that was coming for them. Sarah's work was inside. She filled bathtubs with water, gathered flashlights and batteries, and packed a go bag with first aid supplies, documents, and non-perishable food, an act of preparedness that felt terrifyingly final. She tried to keep a calm and cheerful demeanor for the children, but her hands trembled as she checked the seal on a bag of crackers. With every gust of wind that rattled the windows, the cold knot of dread in her stomach tightened. She found herself whispering prayers under her breath, a running conversation with God that had been a part of her life for as long as she could remember. Keep us safe, Lord. Be our rock and our fortress. Place your hand of protection over this house, over my family. Maya, sensing the shift in the household's energy, had stopped her dancing. She now trailed after her mother, clutching a worn teddy bear named Barnaby. "Is the big rain coming, Mommy?" she asked, her small voice cutting through the tension. Sarah knelt, pulling her daughter into a fierce hug, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair. "Yes, sweetie. A very big rain. But we're all going to be together, right here. And Daddy has made the house super strong, like a castle. And we're going to be okay." She prayed the words were true. By late afternoon, the world outside had been plunged into a premature twilight. The plywood over the windows cast the rooms in an oppressive gloom, illuminated only by the flickering glow of a few battery-powered lanterns. The first true bands of the hurricane arrived, lashing the house with horizontal sheets of rain that sounded like handfuls of gravel being thrown against the walls. The wind, no longer a moan, had risen to a high-pitched, incessant shriek. It was a living thing, a predator circling their home, probing for any weakness. They ate a makeshift dinner of sandwiches and lukewarm soup in the living room, the roar from outside making conversation nearly impossible. The house itself seemed to be groaning under the strain. There were pops and creaks from the attic, the sounds of a structure under immense pressure. David sat with his back straight, his jaw tight, listening to the sounds, diagnosing each one. A loose piece of siding, a branch scraping the roof. His carpenter's mind was trying to impose order on the chaos, to reassure himself that his work would hold. Leo had abandoned his plastic bricks. He sat curled on the couch next to his mother, his face buried in her side. Every time a particularly violent gust of wind slammed into the house, making the floorboards tremble, he would flinch, his small body tensing. "It's okay, honey," Sarah would murmur, stroking his hair. "It's just the wind." But the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. This wasn't just the wind. This was a force of unimaginable power, a raw, untamed piece of creation that had no regard for them or their carefully constructed lives. Around 9 p.m., the lights flickered twice, then died, plunging them into absolute darkness. Sarah let out a small, involuntary gasp. Maya began to cry, a thin, terrified wail. "It's all right, it's all right." David's voice boomed, a little too loudly, from across the room. There was a fumbling sound, then the bright, narrow beam of a powerful flashlight cut through the blackness, finding Maya's tear-streaked face. "See? I've got the light. We knew this would happen. It's all part of the plan." He lit the lanterns they had set out, and their soft, yellow glow pushed back the oppressive dark, creating a small, fragile island of light in the center of their home. But the darkness they couldn't banish was the one outside, the one filled with the shrieking, ravenous voice of the storm. Then came a sound they had all been dreading, the unmistakable, high-pitched splintering of glass. It came from upstairs. "Stay here," David commanded, grabbing a heavy mag light. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his footsteps swallowed by the hurricane's roar. Sarah gathered the children closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could hear David shouting upstairs over the din, the sounds of him moving something heavy. He came back down minutes later, his face grim and his shirt soaked. "It was the window in the guest room," he said, his voice strained. "The plywood must have torn loose. I've blocked the door with the dresser, but water's getting in. The wind. I've never seen anything like it." The admission, coming from him, was terrifying. The chink in his armor of practicality had appeared. The storm intensified. The shrieking of the wind escalated into a deafening, continuous roar, a sound so immense it seemed to come from inside their own skulls. It was the sound of a freight train, a jet engine, 1,000 tormented souls screaming in unison. It was a sound of pure, elemental fury. The entire house was now vibrating, a deep, resonant shudder that traveled from the foundations up through the soles of their feet. Another crash, this one from downstairs, closer. The window in the kitchen shattered, and a violent gust of wind tore through the house, sending papers and pictures flying from the walls. The back door, a solid oak door David had installed himself, was ripped from its hinges with a sound like a gunshot and thrown across the room. The storm was inside. "The bathroom," David yelled, grabbing Maya and shoving her into Sarah's arms. "Now, the center of the house. Go." He grabbed a stunned Leo by the arm, and they scrambled into the small, windowless guest bathroom off the main hallway. David slammed the door shut and braced his body against it, his muscles straining as the wind tried to tear it open. The pressure change made their ears pop. Through the wood, they could hear the symphony of destruction in their home, the crash of falling furniture, the shattering of the television screen, the horrifying sound of water, no longer just rain, but a rushing, gurgling flood, pouring into their sanctuary. They were huddled together in the cramped, dark space. Sarah clutched both children, shielding them with her body. Leo was sobbing uncontrollably, his fear finally breaking through his attempts at bravery. Maya was silent, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it had stolen her voice. She just trembled, her small body shaking against her mother's. David grunted with effort, his feet sliding on the tile floor as he fought to keep the door closed against the cyclonic pressures. "The roof is going," he yelled, his voice ragged. "I can hear it." Above them, there was a terrible, screeching, metallic sound, like giant fingernails being dragged across a chalkboard, followed by a deafening boom that shook the very foundations of the house. A section of the roof had been torn away. Rain and debris began to pour into the hallway just outside their door. Water started seeping under the door, cold and dark, swirling around their ankles. This was it. Sarah knew it with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the tile floor beneath her. David's strength was failing. The house, their fortress, was being dismantled around them, piece by piece. The walls of logic and preparedness had been breached and were now collapsing. They were at the mercy of a power so far beyond their control that it was absolute. Fear, raw and primal, threatened to consume her. She could feel its icy tendrils closing around her heart, whispering of the inevitable. The water was rising. The house was coming apart. They were going to die. She looked at her husband, his face a mess of sweat and rain, his body the only thing standing between them and the storm's full fury. She looked at her son, his face buried in her shoulder, his small body racked with sobs. She looked at her daughter, her precious Maya, paralyzed with fear, her eyes reflecting the antic dance of the flashlight beam. And in that moment of ultimate despair, something shifted within her. It was as if another voice, older and calmer and infinitely more powerful than the voice of fear, rose up from the depths of her soul. It was the voice of her faith, a faith she had nurtured in the quiet moments of her life, in sunny Sunday mornings and whispered bedtime prayers. She had always believed, but now, in the crucible of this terror, belief had to become something more. It had to become their only shield. "David," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos with a strange and sudden clarity. "David, we have to pray." He grunted, his body shuddering with the effort of holding the door. "Sarah, I'm a little busy right here." "No," she insisted, her voice rising in strength, somehow managing to be heard over the tempest. "We've done everything we can do. Everything. Now we have to give it to God. We have to ask for His protection. Now, David. Together. As a family." He didn't answer, but she saw the tension in his shoulders ease for a fraction of a second, a near imperceptible surrender. In the face of annihilation, what else was there? Sarah closed her eyes, shutting out the terrifying darkness, the rising water, the screams of the wind. She pulled her children in so tightly she could feel their frantic heartbeats against her own. "Dear Heavenly Father," she began, her voice shaking but resolute. She did not shout to be heard over the storm. She spoke into the heart of it, into the heart of their small, terrified circle. "Lord God, you are the God who commands the wind and the waves. You are our refuge and our strength, an ever-present help in trouble." Her words, verses she had known her whole life, were no longer just comforting platitudes. They were weapons. They were anchors. "We are so scared, Lord. We are so scared. We see nothing but destruction around us. Our home is being torn apart, but we know that you are bigger than this storm. We are asking you, Father, in the name of your Son Jesus, to be our shield. Be our fortress. Protect my husband. Protect my children." Leo's sobs quieted to whimpers. He listened to his mother's voice, a lifeline in the roaring sea of chaos. "Lord," Sarah continued, tears now streaming down her face, mingling with the spray that misted in from the hallway. "Place your angels around this little room. Build a hedge of protection around us that this storm cannot penetrate. We put our lives, our very breath, into your hands. We trust in you. We have nowhere else to go. Please, God, please save us." She felt a small hand touch her own. It was Maya. Her daughter had stopped trembling. She looked up at her mother, her eyes still wide, but the paralyzing fear had been replaced by a look of profound, childlike trust. "Amen," Maya whispered, her voice barely audible, yet to Sarah, it rang louder than the hurricane. Then, a deeper voice joined in. "Amen," David said, his voice thick with emotion and exhaustion. He still strained against the door, but his fight was no longer just a physical one. He had joined his will to hers, his strength to her faith. Leo, his face still pressed into Sarah's shoulder, mumbled, Amen. They stayed like that, a family of four huddled in a tiny, dark bathroom, the world being torn to shreds around them. Sarah did not stop praying. She began to recite the 23rd Psalm, her voice growing stronger with each word. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Outside, the roar was a physical presence, a monstrous beast trying to claw its way in. He mocketh me to lie down in green pastures. He letteth me beside the still waters. A massive object, a neighbor's propane tank or a piece of their own roof, they would never know, struck the side of the house right next to the bathroom with a deafening, metallic clang that vibrated through their bones. The entire structure groaned and shifted. Maya screamed. David yelled, "Hold on." Yeah, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Sarah's voice rose, defiant and powerful, a tiny candle of a voice against an infinite, roaring darkness. For thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. And then something changed. It was not a sudden silence. The storm did not magically cease. The wind still howled, the rain still hammered down. But the sound, the quality of the roar, shifted. It was subtle at first, a change in pitch. The all-encompassing, ground-shaking roar that had been centered directly on top of them seemed to split. David felt it first. The pressure against the door he was holding lessened, just slightly. It was no longer a solid, irresistible force, but something that was pushing more on the left and the right. He dared to ease his weight back a fraction of an inch. The door held. The freight train sound was no longer directly overhead. It was now two freight trains, one on either side of the house, their terrible chorus receding ever so slightly. The core of the storm, the eye wall with its unsurvivable winds, seemed to be passing them by, leaving them in a pocket of relative, though still terrifying, calm. Above them, the horrible grinding and tearing noises stopped. The house, which had felt as if it were about to be lifted from its very foundations, settled with a final, shuddering groan, and then held. The demonic shriek of the wind became a sustained, deep-throated howl, but it was the sound of a beast passing by, not one that was actively devouring them. No one spoke. They just listened. The water around their ankles stopped rising. The brutal, concussive blows against the walls ceased. The storm was still there, a nightmare of wind and water, but its murderous heart had moved on. Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. They remained in the bathroom, huddled together, listening to the fury of Hurricane Helena as it continued its destructive path inland. The sounds were still terrifying, but they were the sounds of survival, not the sounds of imminent death. David slowly, cautiously, let go of the door. It stayed shut. He slumped against it, his strength completely spent, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He slid down to the floor, the flashlight beam in his hand trembling violently, and pulled his wife and children into his arms. They were alive. They were together. In a house that was surely shattered beyond recognition, in a world that had been scoured by the storm, their small bathroom had become an ark. Their prayer had become a shield. Sarah held her family, her heart overflowing with a gratitude so profound it left no room for any other emotion. The fear was gone, washed away and replaced by an unshakable peace. She didn't know what they would find when they opened the door. She didn't know the extent of the devastation to their home, their town, their lives. But in the flickering, holy light of that small, dark room, she knew one thing with absolute, soul-deep certainty. They had been in the valley of the shadow of death, and they had not been alone. They had called out into the storm, and the God of the storm had heard them. Chapter 2, The Drowning Light. The silence that followed the storm's passing was a thing of substance, a heavy, ringing void that was more unnerving than the preceding roar. For what felt like an eternity, the four of them remained a single, trembling entity in the cramped darkness of the bathroom. The only sounds were the frantic drum of their own hearts, the ragged gasp of their breaths, and the slow, steady drip of water somewhere in the ruined house. A sound like a metronome counting the first seconds of a new and terrifying world. David was the first to move. He uncoiled his body from its braced position against the door, his muscles screaming in protest. The exhaustion that hit him was a physical blow, a weight so immense he felt he might simply dissolve into the shallow, scummy water on the floor. He leaned his head back against the wood, the flashlight beam in his hand dancing a wild jig on the ceiling, illuminating nothing but damp, cracked plaster. Sarah watched him, her own body a collection of aches and a deep, soul-shaking tremor she couldn't control. She held Leo and Maya tightly, their small, warm bodies a confirmation of the impossible. They were alive. The prayer that had been a desperate cry in the darkness now settled in her heart as a quiet, profound hum of gratitude. It was a feeling so immense, so overwhelming. It eclipsed the grief that she knew was waiting just beyond the door. For now, in this small, consecrated space, there was only this: breath, warmth, life. Is it over? Leo's voice was a small, reedy whisper from the folds of his mother's jacket. He had not lifted his head, as if afraid that to look would be to invite the monster back. David cleared his throat, the sound raw and hoarse. The worst of it is, he managed to say, the eye wall has passed. We'll still have wind and rain for hours. But that sound, that was the worst of it. He spoke with the authority of a man who had met the apocalypse and somehow, inexplicably, was still standing. But the certainty was gone from his voice, replaced by a note of sheer, humbled awe. Maya stirred in Sarah's lap. She looked around the tiny, dark room, her eyes adjusting to the erratic beam of the flashlight. "The big rain is gone?" she asked, her voice clear and unafraid. The simple, trusting question of a child who believes her parents can command the weather itself. "Yes, sweetie," Sarah whispered, kissing the top of her damp head. "The big rain is gone." David pushed himself to his feet, a slow, deliberate movement of a man testing to see if his limbs still obeyed. He shone the light on the door, examining the frame, the hinges, his carpenter's mind instinctively beginning to assess, to catalog the damage. "We need to see what we're dealing with," he said, his voice regaining a sliver of its old practicality. "We can't stay in here. If the rest of the house is unstable." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Their sanctuary could easily become their tomb. He put his shoulder to the door and pushed. It didn't budge. He pushed again, harder, grunting with the effort. A sickening scrape of wood on debris met his ears, but the door moved less than an inch. "It's blocked," he said, a fresh wave of adrenaline cutting through his exhaustion. "Something's fallen against it." Sarah felt a cold spike of fear, a return of the claustrophobic terror. Had they survived the storm only to be trapped in this tiny, dark box? She tightened her grip on the children. "Leo, Maya, stay with Mommy," David commanded, his voice sharp. He took a step back, as much as the small space would allow. "Sarah, get against the back wall." He turned and drove his body into the door, a solid, desperate impact of flesh and bone against wood. The door groaned, the frame splintering. A shower of plaster dust rained down from the ceiling. He did it again, a raw, guttural cry tearing from his throat, a sound of pure, primal will. On the third impact, there was a loud crack and the door burst open, swinging into a space that was not their hallway. David stumbled forward into the ruin, the flashlight beam cutting a frantic path through a scene of utter devastation. Sarah, shielding the children behind her, peered through the shattered doorway, and the breath left her body in a silent gasp. The hallway was gone. Where there had once been a wall decorated with family photos, Leo's first steps, Maya's toothless grin, their wedding day, there was now a gaping maw that opened directly into the churning, gray twilight of the storm. The roof above it had been peeled back like the lid of a tin can, and rain was still pouring in, soaking a mountain of splintered 2x4s, shredded insulation, and unrecognizable debris that was piled against their bathroom door. The opposite wall had collapsed inward, and through it, they could see the mangled remains of their living room. David stood frozen in the middle of the wreckage, slowly panning the flashlight beam. The light caught on the splintered leg of their sofa, upturned and absurd. It illuminated a single, muddy page from one of Leo's books about dinosaurs, the illustration of a Tyrannosaurus rex looking somehow both ferocious and pathetic. It glinted off the shards of what had been their television screen. He had built this house to be strong. He had used hurricane straps and reinforced joints. He had driven every nail himself, confident in the integrity of his work. And the storm had dismantled it with the casual, thoughtless cruelty of a giant child tearing apart a toy. The logic of wood and nails had been answered by the illogical, absolute power of the wind, and the argument had been settled decisively. "Oh, David," Sarah whispered, stepping carefully over the threshold, her hand still clutching Maya's. He didn't seem to hear her. He was staring at the pile of wreckage that had blocked their door. It was a chaotic jumble of their lives, but at its core, identifiable by a few remaining shingles and the splintered remains of a massive beam, was a large section of their own roof. It had crashed down precisely where their hallway had been, creating a dense, heavy barrier that had, ironically, likely reinforced the wall of the bathroom against the storm's incredible pressure. They picked their way through the debris, a treacherous landscape of twisted metal, shattered glass, and slick, muddy wood. Leo's eyes were wide, his face a mask of shocked disbelief. He was trying to reconcile this alien, war-torn landscape with the memory of his home. It was a cognitive leap his 10-year-old mind simply could not make. Maya, however, pointed a small finger at the chaos. "Messy," she declared, with the simple finality of a 6-year-old. They reached the ruin of the living room. It was worse than a mess. It was an annihilation. The large bay window that had looked out over the dunes was gone, the entire wall with it. The storm had entered here and had its way with everything inside. The floor was covered in a thick layer of sand and seawater, littered with seaweed and the pathetic, broken bodies of seabirds. The furniture was a heap of sodden, broken kindling pushed against the far wall. The floorboards, which David had so carefully laid and stained, were warped and buckled. Sarah saw a flash of yellow in the debris. She bent down and pulled it from the muck. It was Barnaby, Maya's teddy bear, soaked and missing an eye, but intact. She held it out to her daughter. Maya took the bear and hugged it to her chest, a small, familiar comfort in a world rendered terrifyingly unfamiliar. David moved like a man in a trance, his flashlight beam continuing its grim inventory. He walked to where the back of the house should have been. The kitchen, the dining room, they had ceased to exist. The back wall had been completely sheared off, and their view was of the churning, gray ocean, which now seemed impossibly close. The storm surge had come up higher than anyone had predicted, a roiling, angry beast that had chewed away the dunes and was now licking at the very foundations of their shattered home. The seafoam green clapboard was gone, revealing the skeleton of the house, the bones picked clean. He saw the source of the crash they'd heard during the storm's peak. The heavy oak door he'd been so proud of lay 20 feet away, half buried in the sand, ripped from its hinges as if it were made of cardboard. He had anchored that door into the frame with 6-inch steel bolts. The storm had taken the bolts and the frame with it. He felt a strange detachment, a numbness that held the overwhelming grief and rage at bay. His mind couldn't process the totality of the loss. Instead, it clung to the small, specific details. The way the copper plumbing had been twisted into a grotesque sculpture, the single, unbroken plate sitting incongruously on a pile of rubble, the curtains from the kitchen window tangled in the branches of a fallen cypress tree 50 yards down the beach. "David." Sarah's voice was soft, pulling him back from the edge of his shock. The children are cold. He turned. Leo was shivering, his arms wrapped around himself, his sneakers soaked through. Maya had buried her face in the damp fur of her teddy bear. The reality of their situation crashed down on him. They had survived. But survival was only the first step. They were homeless, exposed to the elements, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a single flashlight. "The stairs are gone," he said, his voice flat. "We can't get to the bedrooms. Whatever was up there, it's probably gone anyway." His eyes went back to the gaping hole where the roof had been. He could see the sky, a canvas of bruised purple and violent gray, the clouds still racing inland. The dawn was coming, a drowning light, promising visibility but no warmth, no comfort. It would only serve to illuminate the full scope of their desolation. "We need to find shelter," he said, his protector instincts taking over again. It was a relief to have a task, a problem to solve, something with a roof. "And we need to get away from the water. The surge could come back." He looked around at the neighboring houses, or where they should have been. The Hendersons' quaint blue cottage to their right was simply gone. Not damaged, not ruined. Gone. Only the concrete slab of its foundation remained, a ghostly footprint on the ravaged landscape. On their left, the large, modern vacation rental owned by a family from up north had collapsed in on itself, a multi-story pile of splintered lumber and shattered glass. There was nowhere to go. Every fortress had fallen. As the pre-dawn light grew stronger, painting the world in shades of monochrome gray, the true nature of their survival became chillingly clear. They were standing on a small, elevated section of their ground floor. The bathroom they had sheltered in was at the back of this section, tucked into the lee of the gentle rise upon which the house had been built. The rest of the house, particularly the parts that had faced the ocean, had been scythed away. Then David saw it. It was the reason they were alive. The old live oak, a magnificent, sprawling giant that had stood on the rise behind their house for what must have been 200 years, was no more. The hurricane had finally bested it, but it had not surrendered quietly. In its death throes, the colossal tree had fallen towards the house. Its massive trunk, easily 5 feet in diameter, had missed the structure by inches. But its enormous, sprawling limbs, a dense network of wood as thick as a man's body, had crashed down upon the roof. And they had formed a shield. 2 of the largest limbs had struck the roof on either side of the small guest bathroom, shattering and crushing everything they touched. But they had created a near-perfect V-shape, a protective cradle directly over the one room in which the family had taken refuge. The limbs had absorbed the impact of the flying debris. They had deflected the unimaginable force of the wind. The section of roof that had fallen into the hallway had been cut loose by the tree's impact, not torn away by the wind. The tree had sacrificed itself, and in doing so, had created an almost miraculous pocket of safety in the midst of total destruction. David walked slowly towards the back of the house, towards the fallen giant. He reached out and laid a hand on its wet, rough bark. He could see the splintered base of the trunk where it had been ripped from the earth, its vast root system exposed to the sky like the nerves of an extracted tooth. He traced the line of the massive limb that rested now on the remnants of his roof, its smaller branches and twigs forming a tangled, protective thatch over the bathroom. The physics of it were improbable. The angle of the fall, the way the branches had distributed the force, it was a 1 in a million chance. A coincidence of such staggering unlikelihood as to be statistically impossible. His logical, carpenter's mind tried to calculate the variables, the wind speed, the tree's load-bearing capacity, the trajectory of its collapse. But the numbers didn't add up. It made no sense. "David, what is it?" Sarah had followed him, the children trailing behind her like ducklings. He couldn't speak. He just pointed. At the tree. At the V-shape it had formed over the bathroom. At the utter devastation on either side of that small, protected space. Sarah's gaze followed his finger. Her eyes widened. She saw it instantly, not through the lens of physics and probability, but through the lens of faith. She saw the hedge of protection she had prayed for. She saw the hand of God made manifest in bark and splintered wood. The Lord's rod and staff, they comfort me. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a fallen oak tree. Tears, hot and silent, began to stream down her face, mingling with the rain. It was not a cry of grief for her lost home, but a cry of overwhelming, terrifying gratitude. She understood, in that moment, the true meaning of awe, a feeling that was equal parts wonder and terror. To be so close to annihilation, to be spared by something so far beyond comprehension, was to be fundamentally and irrevocably changed. She pulled Leo and Maya close. "You see?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You see? I told you we would be safe. He kept us safe." Leo stared at the tree, then at the bathroom, then back at the tree. His anxious, orderly mind finally found something it could grasp onto, a reason for the chaos. It wasn't random. There was a reason they had survived. His mother's stories, the prayers he mumbled at bedtime, they were real. The monster had come, but a bigger force had stood in its way. David, however, was still wrestling with it. He looked from the tree to his wife's tear-streaked, illuminated face. He saw the absolute certainty in her eyes. He remembered her voice in the bathroom, cutting through the roar, resolute and strong. He remembered his own grudging, desperate and man. He had spent his life believing in the things he could measure, cut, and join. He believed in the strength of his own two hands. And in a single night, that belief had been systematically dismantled. His walls had failed. His roof had failed. His door had been ripped from its hinges. Everything he had built, everything he had trusted, had been utterly and completely insufficient. And what had saved them? An impossible prayer and an improbable tree. He felt a crack in the foundation of his own soul, a deep, seismic shift in the bedrock of his understanding of the world. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was terrifying. It was easier to believe in the randomness of a storm than in a God who would allow such devastation and then pluck you from the middle of it like a child saving a single toy soldier from a battlefield. What did that mean for the Hendersons, their kind, elderly neighbors? What did it mean for the family in the vacation rental? His mind recoiled from the implications. "It's just a tree," he mumbled, the words sounding hollow and foolish even to his own ears. He needed a rational explanation. He needed the world to make sense again. "No, David," Sarah said softly, stepping closer to him, her hand finding his. Her touch was an anchor. "It's not just a tree." Before he could answer, a new sound cut through the wind and the dripping water. It was a human sound, a faint, wavering cry. "Help! Please, help me!" They both froze, turning their heads towards the sound. It was coming from the direction of the collapsed vacation rental, from beneath the mountain of wreckage that had been a house just yesterday. The philosophical debate in David's mind vanished, replaced by an immediate, urgent purpose. Someone was alive in there. Someone needed help. "Sarah, take the kids," he said, his voice instantly taking on a tone of command. "Get them back to the bathroom. It's the safest place. Huddle together, stay warm. Don't come out." "David, what are you going to do?" she asked, her eyes wide with a new fear. "There's someone in there," he said, nodding towards the collapsed house. He squeezed her hand, a brief, firm gesture of reassurance. "I have to try." His exhaustion was gone, burned away by a fresh surge of adrenaline. The grief for his home was shelved, to be dealt with later. The unsettling questions about faith and miracles were postponed. Here was something tangible, a problem that could be solved not with prayer, but with leverage and strength. Here was a way to put his hands to work, to impose some small measure of order on the chaos, to be the man he knew how to be. He scanned the debris field around him, his carpenter's eye searching for a tool. He spotted a long, solid piece of a 4x4 beam, its end splintered but its length intact. A pry bar. He grabbed it, testing its weight. It felt good in his hands. Solid. Dependable. Help. Is anyone there? The voice was stronger now, closer. A man's voice, laced with pain and desperation. I'm coming, David shouted, his voice swallowed by the wind, but propelled by a fierce determination. Hold on. I'm coming. He turned back to Sarah one last time. In the gray, watery light of the new day, he saw her clutching their children, her face a mixture of fear for him and unwavering faith. She gave him a single, sharp nod. It was all the blessing he needed. With the makeshift pry bar balanced on his shoulder, David Miller, the builder whose house had been destroyed, began to climb carefully over the wreckage of his own life, moving towards the sound of a stranger in need. He was surrounded by the evidence of his own powerlessness, yet he had never felt a stronger sense of purpose. The storm had taken his home, but it had left him his family, his strength, and a chance to build something new, even if it was just a path through the rubble to save a single life. The sun had not yet risen, but in the heart of the devastation, a different kind of light was beginning to dawn. Chapter 3, The Weight of a Life. The world beyond the shattered frame of David's home was a monochrome etching of ruin, rendered in infinite shades of gray. Rain, no longer a horizontal fusillade but a persistent, weeping drizzle, slicked every surface, turning splintered wood black and shredded insulation into a sodden, pulpy mash. The air, thick with the smell of salt, pine resin, and the damp, metallic scent of devastation, was a physical presence, heavy in his lungs. Each step David took was a calculated risk, a test of his weight against the chaotic equilibrium of the wreckage. The makeshift pry bar, the 4x4 beam, felt both ridiculously inadequate and reassuringly solid on his shoulder. It was a tool, and tools were the language he understood. They translated will into action. As he navigated the treacherous terrain between his foundation and the collapsed heap of the vacation rental, his mind, a builder's mind, was working against his will, deconstructing the catastrophe around him. He saw the sheer failure in the joists of the Hendersons' vanished cottage, the torque that had twisted the steel I-beams of the rental house into metallic pretzels. He saw the nail patterns ripped clean from the plywood sheathing, the hurricane straps stretched to their breaking point and beyond. He saw 100 small engineering failures, a symphony of destruction where every component had been asked to bear a load beyond its design, beyond imagination. And every calculation, every observation, ended with the same humbling conclusion. Nothing he could have built would have stood. The cry came again, closer this time, and it cut through his analytical detachment. Here. Over here, please. The VO. Ice was thin, frayed by exhaustion and pain. It came from the heart of the collapsed structure, a 3-story testament to modern design that had folded in on itself like a house of cards. The top 2 floors had pancaked down onto the first, creating a dense, multi-layered sandwich of drywall, flooring, furniture, and dreams. Finding one person, and that was like searching for a needle in a haystack made of splinters. I hear you, David shouted, his voice hoarse. Keep talking. Talk to me so I can find you. My leg. I think my leg is broken, the voice rasped. I can't move it. Pinned. I'm pinned under something. David scrambled over a collapsed exterior wall, his boots sinking into what had been an insulated interior partition. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead. He followed the sound, his eyes scanning the jumble for any sign of life, any gap in the debris. He saw a crushed sectional sofa, its cheerful floral pattern obscene amidst the ruin. He saw a high-end stainless steel refrigerator lying on its side, its door blown open to reveal an interior that was now filled with sand and rainwater. He saw a child's bicycle, its front wheel bent into a perfect right angle. The casual artifacts of a family's vacation, now exhibits in a museum of chaos. Where are you? David yelled again. The kitchen, I think. The island, the granite island, is on me. David's blood ran cold. Granite. He knew the weight of a slab of granite countertop. It was measured not in pounds, but in fractions of a ton. His 4x4 was a toothpick against such a weight. A grim reality began to settle in. He might be able to find this man, but he would not be able to free him. Not alone. He pushed the thought away. One step at a time. First, find him. He circled a massive pile of rubble, where the second floor seemed to have collapsed almost intact, creating a dangerous-looking lean-to. Beneath it, in a dark, cramped cavity, he saw movement. "Hey, in here," the voice called, a note of desperate hope entering his tone. David dropped to his hands and knees, ignoring the sharp protest of his overstrained muscles. He crawled into the space, the flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The smell was stronger here, wet plaster dust, the ozone scent of fried electronics, and something else, something coppery and vital. The space was no more than 3 feet high, a claustrophobic cavern formed by the floor above resting precariously on the buckled remains of the kitchen cabinets. And there he was. The man was in his late 50s or early 60s, his face pale and clammy with shock, etched with deep lines of pain. He wore the remnants of a polo shirt and khaki shorts, clothes for a sunny afternoon of golf, not for an apocalypse. His left leg was trapped from the thigh down beneath a massive, impossibly heavy slab of speckled gray granite, the kitchen island. The angle of the leg was unnatural, and the khaki shorts were darkening with a slow, steady seep of blood. "Thank God," the man breathed, his eyes locking onto David's. I thought we were the only ones. I thought everyone was gone." "My name is David," he said, keeping his voice as calm and steady as he could manage. He crawled closer, shining the light on the man's leg. It was bad. The granite slab was at least 8 feet long and 3 feet wide, a solid 3 centimeters thick. It rested not only on the man's leg, but on a heap of other debris, which was the only reason his leg hadn't been severed completely. "I'm Arthur," the man said, his breath catching in a pained sob. "My wife, Eleanor, she's in here with me. She was right beside me when it came down. She's not answering me." David's heart sank further. He moved the flashlight beam past Arthur. In the deeper shadows of the cavity, he could just make out a second form, a woman lying still, partially buried under a collapsed section of cabinetry and drywall. There was no visible movement. "Okay, Arthur," David said, forcing a tone of professional confidence he was nowhere near feeling. He was a builder, not a paramedic. "We're going to take this one step at a time. First, we need to see if we can relieve some of this pressure." He looked at the granite slab, his mind working furiously. It was a leverage problem. A simple, brutal physics equation. The weight of the slab was the load. His 4x4 was the lever. He needed a fulcrum, and he needed a force far greater than he alone could provide. "Don't worry about me," Arthur whispered, his gaze fixed on the shadows where his wife lay. "Check on her. Please. You have to check on her first." The selflessness of the request, from a man in such agony, struck David with a profound force. He nodded, crawling past Arthur into the tighter space. "Eleanor," he called softly. He reached out and touched her shoulder. It was cold, colder than the rain-chilled air. He felt for a pulse in her neck, his fingers pressing against the still, unresponsive flesh. Nothing. He shone the light on her face. Her eyes were half open, her expression vacant. There was an injury to her head, a dark stain matting her gray hair. It was obvious she had been killed instantly. A wave of nausea and grief. Grief for a stranger, for the sheer, brutal unfairness of it, washed over David. He had seen his own home destroyed, but this was different. This was the irrefutable, intimate finality of death. He backed away slowly, his mind struggling to form the words. He looked at Arthur, at the desperate hope in the man's pain-filled eyes. He couldn't tell him. Not now. Not while Arthur was trapped, helpless. The truth would be another weight, a crushing one, and right now, the granite was more than enough. "She's unconscious," David lied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. She's pinned in a bad way. We need to get you out first, Arthur. If we move this slab, it could shift everything, and it might make things worse for her. The best way to help her is to get you free, so we have more room to work. It was a plausible lie. A builder's lie, based on load distribution and structural integrity. Arthur seemed to accept it, his face tightening with a renewed sense of purpose. Okay, he nodded, gritting his teeth. Okay, whatever you say. Let's do it. David crawled back out of the hole into the gray, drizzling morning. He stood up, his body aching, his mind reeling. The task before him was monumental. He wedged the end of his 4x4 under the edge of the granite slab. He searched for a fulcrum, something solid in the shifting sea of debris. He found a chunk of shattered cinder block and kicked it into place. He put all his weight on the end of the beam. He strained, his muscles bunching, a groan tearing from his throat. The beam bowed, the wood creaking in protest. The granite slab didn't move. Not a millimeter. It was like trying to pry up the sidewalk. The weight was absolute. He tried again, repositioning the fulcrum, changing the angle of his attack. Nothing. The sheer, immovable mass of it mocked his efforts. The powerlessness he'd felt in the roaring darkness of the storm returned, a cold, sickening blanket. He was not strong enough. His best efforts were futile. He sank to his knees in the mud and debris, the 4x4 clattering beside him. Rain ran down his face, mixing with the sweat of his exertion. He looked back at his own ruined house, a dark skeleton against the bruised sky. He could see the bathroom, the small, intact section of his life where his family was waiting. He had promised them he would try, but trying wasn't enough. What now? Give up? Go back to Sarah and the kids and tell them there was a man dying 50 yards away, and he could do nothing to stop it? The thought was unbearable. He remembered Sarah's face in the storm, her calm, unwavering faith. He kept us safe. He remembered the impossible physics of the fallen oak tree. A surge of anger, hot and clean, burned through his despair. Anger at the storm, anger at the granite, anger at his own weakness. He would not be beaten. He refused. If strength wasn't the answer, then he needed a better idea. His mind, the builder's mind, went to work again, not on deconstruction, but on construction, on a solution. He needed a better lever, a longer one, to multiply the force. He needed a stronger fulcrum, and he needed more weight. He was just one man, but he wasn't. He stood up and turned back towards his house. Sarah, he roared, his voice a raw, desperate bellow that carried across the ravaged landscape. Sarah, I need you. It felt like an eternity, but it was probably only a minute before he saw her emerge from the shattered doorway of their home. She moved carefully, picking her way across the debris field, her face a mask of concern. What is it? What's wrong? She called out, her voice thin against the sound of the wind. There's a man trapped in here. I can't move it alone, he shouted. The kids. They're in the bathtub. I told them not to move. They're scared, but they're okay. David, what? She reached him and peered into the dark cavity. She saw Arthur, his pale, strained face. Her hand flew to her mouth. Oh, dear God. His wife is in there, too, David said, his voice low and grim. Sarah, I can't lift this thing. It's too heavy. Sarah looked at the granite slab, then at the 4x4 on the ground, then at her husband's exhausted, desperate face. There was no hesitation. The woman who had faced down the storm with prayer now faced this new mountain with a fierce resolve. Then we'll lift it together, she said simply. What do you need me to do? The sight of her, so resolute, so ready, bolstered him. I need a better lever. Something longer. And a better fulcrum. Something solid. They searched the debris field together, a desperate treasure hunt in the world's most depressing junkyard. It was Sarah who found the lever, a 10-foot section of steel stud from a commercial-grade interior wall, bent, but still incredibly strong. It was David who found the fulcrum. His eyes lit up when he saw it. a solid section of the rental's fireplace hearth, a block of engineered concrete that hadn't shattered. It was heavy, but together, they managed to roll it into position near the granite slab. They slid the steel stud into the gap beneath the granite, positioning it over the concrete fulcrum. This new lever extended nearly 7 feet out from the pivot point. The physics were better now. Much better. Okay, David said, taking a position at the very end of the bar. Sarah, get next to me. When I say 3, we put every ounce of weight we have onto this thing. Don't jerk it. Just a steady, downward press. Ready? She nodded, her jaw set, her hands gripping the cold, wet steel beside his. Arthur, David yelled into the hole. We're going to try and lift it now. It might only move an inch, but I need you to pull your leg out the second you feel it go slack. Do you understand? A weak yes came from within. Okay, David breathed, looking at Sarah. He saw in her eyes the same fear and determination he felt in his own heart. They were in this together. 1, 2, 3. They threw their combined weight onto the steel bar. David grunted, every muscle in his back and shoulders screaming. Sarah let out a low cry of exertion, her knuckles white on the bar. The steel groaned. The concrete fulcrum bit into the soft earth. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. More, David roared. He pushed down harder, feeling a sharp pain in his lower back. He ignored it. And then, slowly, miraculously, the end of the granite slab began to lift. It was an infinitesimal movement, a fraction of an inch, then a full inch, then 2. The weight was immense, a living thing that fought them every step of the way. Now, Arthur. Now, David screamed, his voice cracking with the strain. From inside the cavity, they heard a strangled cry of agony, the sickening, grating sound of bone and flesh being dragged from under the immense pressure. I'm stuck, Arthur cried out. My shoe, it's caught on something. David and Sarah exchanged a look of pure panic. They couldn't hold the weight for long. Their strength was already fading. The bar was slipping in their wet hands. Hold on, David yelled. Just hold on. He looked wildly around, his mind racing. He saw his old pry bar, the 4x4, lying nearby. An idea, born of pure desperation, struck him. Sarah, can you hold it? Just for a second? Can you hold it alone? She looked at him, her eyes wide, her arms trembling violently. She didn't answer in words, but gave a short, sharp nod. Her teeth gritted so hard, he could see the muscles in her jaw bulge. It was an impossible request, but David had no choice. He let go of the bar. Sarah's end immediately sagged, and a pained gasp escaped her lips as she took the full strain of the lever. The granite slab dropped an inch, drawing another scream from Arthur. David lunged for the 4x4. He scrambled to the other side of the slab and, with a desperate heave, jammed the wooden beam into the gap they had created. Okay, he yelled. Let it down. Easy. Sarah eased her weight off the steel bar. The granite slab settled, not back onto Arthur's leg, but onto the block of wood David had wedged underneath. The 4x4, the tool that had been too weak to lift, was just strong enough to hold. It creaked and groaned, the fibers of the wood compressing, but it held. They had bought themselves time. David didn't waste a second. He scrambled back into the hole. Arthur was hyperventilating, his face ashen. David saw the problem immediately. The man's work boot was snagged on a piece of rebar sticking out from the shattered concrete floor. I'm going to untie your boot, Arthur, David said, his hands already working on the wet, muddy laces. We'll leave it behind. His fingers were clumsy, shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion, but he managed to unknot the laces and pull the boot loose. The foot within was a mangled, bloody mess, but it was free. Okay, I'm going to pull you now, David said, grabbing Arthur under the arms. This is going to hurt. I'm sorry. On 3. 1, 2, 3. He dragged the man backward, out of the dark cavity and into the gray light. Arthur screamed, a raw, high-pitched sound of pure agony as his shattered leg was pulled clear of the wreckage. David didn't stop until they were several feet away from the unstable collapse. Sarah rushed to Arthur's side, her face pale. She tore a long strip from the bottom of her own shirt, creating a makeshift bandage, her hands moving with a fluid, maternal competence. They had done it. He was out. He was free. A wave of light-headed relief washed over David, so potent it made him dizzy. He leaned against a collapsed wall, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. His back throbbed, and his hands were raw and bleeding. Arthur, propped up against a piece of drywall, grabbed David's arm. His grip was surprisingly strong. "Eleanor," he choked out, his eyes wild with a mixture of pain and desperate hope. "Go get my Eleanor." David's heart plummeted back into the abyss. The lie he had told now had to be unmade. He looked at Sarah. She met his gaze, her expression full of a sad, compassionate understanding. She knew. She had probably known the moment she looked into the hole. She gave him a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "Not yet. Let's get you somewhere safe first, Arthur," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "We need to get you out of the rain. We can't leave you here." "No," Arthur protested, trying to push himself up. "I'm not leaving her." "Arthur," David said, his voice heavy with a truth he could no longer postpone. He knelt beside the injured man. "Arthur, I checked on her when I first got to you. I'm so sorry. She was gone already. It was instant. I don't think she felt any pain." The words hung in the air, seemingly absorbed by the rain and the wreckage. Arthur stared at him, his face slack with incomprehension. He shook his head slowly, a child refusing to believe an unwelcome fact. "No," he whispered. "No, you're wrong. You have to be wrong. She was talking to me. Right before it all came down, she was talking to me. We were talking about the grandkids." Tears began to stream from Arthur's eyes, cutting clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. A low, guttural sound of grief started deep in his chest, a sound of such profound and absolute loss that it seemed to make the very air vibrate. It was the sound of a life being torn in two. He collapsed back, his body racked with sobs, his gaze fixed on the dark hole where the love of his life still lay. David and Sarah could do nothing but bear witness to his grief. There were no words, no comfort they could offer that would be anything but an insult to the magnitude of his pain. David felt a hollow ache in his own chest, an echo of Arthur's sorrow. He looked at Sarah and saw tears welling in her own eyes. The sun, a pale, watery disk, was finally beginning to break through the thinning clouds. The drowning light of dawn was giving way to the harsh, clarifying light of morning. It illuminated the full, breathtaking scope of the devastation that stretched in every direction. It was a world washed clean of all color, all comfort, all sense. The immediate, desperate purpose of the rescue was over, and in its place, a new, heavier reality settled upon David. He had saved a life, but he had failed to save another. He had pulled a man from the jaws of death only to deliver him into a world of unbearable grief. He looked at Arthur, sobbing uncontrollably. He looked at Sarah, her face streaked with rain and tears. He thought of his children, huddled in the darkness of a ruined bathtub, their world shrunk to a few square feet of tile and fear. They were all survivors, but survival was not an ending. It was a beginning of a new and terrible chapter for which none of them were prepared. They had no home, no food, no clean water, no communication with the outside world. And they were no longer a family of four. They were a small, broken tribe of five, bound together by tragedy and the shared, sacred air they drew into their lungs. David looked at Arthur, then back towards the small, sheltered corner of his own destroyed house. The weight of the granite slab had been lifted, but as the morning light spread across the ruins, David felt a new weight settle upon his shoulders, far heavier and more complex than stone. It was the weight of all these lives, their futures, their sorrows, and their hopes. It was the weight of leadership. "Come on," he said softly, his voice raspy with exhaustion. He put a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Let's get him home." Chapter 4. Shelter from the storm. Home. The word was a bitter irony, a ghost of a concept. What was home now? It was not the structure of wood and nails that David had built with his own hands, the vessel of their memories, now a splintered carcass open to the sky. It was this, a cramped, porcelain antile cave, the small, miraculously intact bathroom where his family had ridden out the apocalypse. And it was to this fragile sanctuary, this final bastion of their world, that they now had to bring a broken stranger. The journey was a scant 50 yards, a distance David could have jogged in seconds in the world that existed 2 days ago. Now, it was a treacherous expedition across a hostile, alien landscape. The first challenge was transport. Arthur could not walk, could barely remain conscious. His shattered leg was a dead weight, a gruesome anchor of flesh and bone. "We need a stretcher," David said, his voice a low rasp. His builder's mind, his only reliable tool in this chaos, was already scanning the wreckage for a solution. "A door," Sarah suggested, her gaze following his. "An interior door. It would be flat, strong enough." It was the perfect solution. They found one nearby, a simple 6-panel door from what might have been a bedroom, blown clean off its hinges and lying half submerged in a muddy pool of rainwater. It was waterlogged and heavy, but it was intact. Together, they heaved it out of the muck and dragged it over to where Arthur lay, his shivering form now covered with Sarah's own oversized rain jacket, that the muscles in his jaw stood out like ropes. 1, 2, 3. A scream, thin and sharp, was torn from Arthur's throat as they lifted him. David felt the unnatural movement of the bones in the man's leg, a sickening grind that traveled up his arms. He forced himself to ignore it, to focus on the mechanics, the simple physics of lifting and placing. They settled Arthur onto the door, his body trembling uncontrollably. "Okay," David breathed, wiping a mixture of rain and sweat from his eyes. "Okay, now we move." He took the front of the door, Sarah the back. They lifted. The combined weight of the man and the sodden wood was immense. Every muscle in David's back, already strained from the effort with the granite slab, screamed in protest. He could see Sarah's arms shaking, her face a mask of fierce concentration. Their progress was agonizingly slow. Each step was a negotiation with gravity and the treacherous terrain. They shuffled over slick, broken drywall, navigated around tangles of exposed wiring that snaked through the debris like metallic vines, and balanced precariously on shattered floor joists that bridged muddy chasms. The world was a jungle gym built by a mad god, and they were the exhausted contestants in his cruel game. Arthur was silent now, his initial scream having taken what little strength he had left. He had retreated into a state of shock, his eyes half closed, his breathing shallow and rapid. Occasionally, a low moan would escape his lips, a sound that seemed to come from a great and distant depth of pain. For David, the journey became a trance of pure physical exertion. Lift, step, balance, repeat. His world shrank to the few feet of ground in front of him, the feel of the splintered door edge digging into his raw palms, the sound of Sarah's strained breathing behind him. He didn't allow himself to think about Eleanor, lying cold in the wreckage they were leaving behind. He didn't allow himself to think about the overwhelming scope of their predicament. He could only think about the next step, and the one after that. It was the builder's way. You don't build a house, you lay one board, then the next, then the one after that. They reached the gaping wound that had been his front door. He could see into the relative darkness of the bathroom. 2 small faces, pale and wide-eyed, peered out from the doorway. Leo and Mia. Sarah saw them too. "It's okay, babies," she called out, her voice strained but steady. "Mommy and Daddy are here. We have someone with us who is hurt. We need to help him." They maneuvered the door through the shattered opening, a process that involved tilting it at a dangerous angle, drawing another sharp gasp of pain from Arthur. Finally, they were inside, in the cramped, familiar space of their last refuge. They gently lowered the door to the floor, the cramped quarters forcing Mia and Leo to press themselves into the corner by the shower stall. The air in the bathroom was close and smelled of fear, dust, and damp towels. Seeing it now, after being out in the vast, open wound of the world, David was struck by how small and fragile it was. It was less a shelter and more a shared tomb. The arrival of Arthur had shrunk the space even further. The five of them were packed in like sardines, the intimacy of their situation both a comfort and a claustrophobic burden. Mia, her thumb firmly in her mouth, stared at Arthur's leg. Her eyes were huge, unblinking pools of horrified fascination. Leo, ever the little man, stood straighter, his expression a mixture of fear and a solemn, boyish sense of duty. "Is he going to die?" Leo asked, his voice a small, clear whisper in the heavy silence. "No," Sarah said, immediately kneeling beside him, pulling both children into her arms. "No, sweetie. He is very hurt, but we're going to help him get better. We have to be his doctors right now." While Sarah comforted the children, creating a small, temporary shield of maternal love against the harsh reality that had invaded their sanctuary, David turned his attention to Arthur's injury. Now, in the slightly better, focused light of the single flashlight they had, he could see the full extent of the damage. It was far worse than he had imagined. The khaki shorts were shredded and soaked in blood that was a terrifyingly bright, arterial red. The flesh of the thigh was torn open in a deep, ragged gash, and below the knee, the leg was bent at an angle that defied nature. Shards of bone, white and sharp, were visible through the torn skin. A wave of nausea rolled through David's stomach. This wasn't a simple fracture. This was a catastrophic, life-altering injury. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and tight. "I need the first aid kit. And all the towels. And that bottle of hydrogen peroxide from under the sink." He worked with a grim, methodical focus, shifting from builder to medic out of sheer necessity. He used his pocket knife, wiped clean with a precious alcohol swab from the kit, to carefully cut away the remaining fabric of Arthur's shorts from around the wound. Arthur, roused from his stupor by the fresh agony, groaned and tried to pull away. I know, David murmured, holding the leg steady. "Just hold on, Arthur. We have to clean it. We have to stop the bleeding." Sarah was at his side, handing him supplies. She tore one of the clean bath towels into long strips. She poured the hydrogen peroxide onto a washcloth, her hand steady despite the horrific sight before them. The children watched, silent and huddled together, their innocence being stripped away layer by painful layer with every grim task their parents performed. When David pressed the peroxide-soaked cloth to the open wound, Arthur screamed again, a raw, animal sound that echoed in the small tiled space. He thrashed, his arms flailing. "Hold him," David grunted to Sarah. She leaned over Arthur, pinning his shoulders with her weight, her voice a soothing, desperate murmur in his ear. "It's okay, Arthur. It's okay. You're safe now. We're here. Just breathe with me. Breathe with me." The cleaning was a brutal, medieval process. They had no anesthetic, no painkillers stronger than a few dusty ibuprofen they found in the back of the medicine cabinet, which David crushed and mixed with a little of their dwindling bottled water for Arthur to swallow. Every touch was an agony for him, and a fresh wave of horror for everyone else. But they had to do it. David knew enough about construction site injuries to know that infection was a killer, as deadly as any storm. The bleeding was the next crisis. The gash on the thigh was deep, and the blood flowed with a terrifying, pulsing rhythm. David pressed a thick pad of folded towel against it, applying direct, steady pressure. "I need to splint it," he said, his eyes scanning their tiny prison for materials. "The bone is completely shattered. We have to immobilize it." His gaze fell on the wreckage of the bathroom door, which had been torn from its frame and lay splintered against the wall. The vertical stiles, the long, solid pieces of wood on either side, were exactly what he needed. With a grunt of effort, he wrenched one of the stiles free, then broke it in two over his knee, creating two rough, 3-foot-long boards. The setting of the leg was the worst part. David knew, with a sinking certainty, that he was probably doing more harm than good, that a real doctor would be horrified. But he also knew that leaving the leg at its current unnatural angle was not an option. "Sarah, I need you to pull," he instructed, his voice grim. "When I tell you, you're going to pull on his foot. Pull straight, as hard as you can. It's going to set the bone, or something close to it." Sarah looked at him, her face pale, her eyes wide with dread. "David, I can't." "You can," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He met her gaze, and in that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. They were partners in this. They would bear this horror together. She nodded, her lips a thin, white line, and moved to Arthur's foot. "Arthur," David said, leaning close to the man's ear. "This is the last thing. The worst thing. I need you to bite down on this." He folded another washcloth into a thick square and placed it between Arthur's teeth. Then he looked at Sarah. "Now." Sarah pulled. Arthur's body arched off the floor, his muffled scream filling the room. David, using all his strength, forced the broken lower leg into alignment with the thigh. There was a wet, grating pop that made his stomach heave. He immediately placed the wooden stiles on either side of the leg and began to bind them tightly with the strips of towel Sarah had prepared, lashing the makeshift splint into place until the entire limb was rigid from hip to ankle. When it was done, the 5 of them were left in a state of shared, trembling exhaustion. Arthur had mercifully passed out. The floor was a mess of bloody towels and discarded first aid supplies. The air was thick with the coppery smell of blood and the sterile scent of peroxide. Silence descended, heavy and absolute. It was broken only by a small, choked sob from the corner. It was Mia. She had her face buried in Leo's side, her small body shaking. Leo, for his part, had his arm around her, his own face stoic but for the single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. Sarah went to them, her movements slow and weary, and enveloped them in her arms. She didn't say anything, just held them, rocking them gently, humming a tune that was barely audible, a fragile melody of comfort against an overwhelming score of despair. David slumped against the wall, his body finally admitting its utter depletion. His muscles ached, his head throbbed, and his hands shook with the aftermath of adrenaline. He looked at the scene before him. A grievously wounded man unconscious on the floor, his children, traumatized and weeping, his wife, a pillar of impossible strength, trying to hold their broken world together. This was his home now. This was his family. As the afternoon wore on, a new kind of quiet settled in. The rain had finally stopped, and the silence it left behind was profound, broken only by the steady drip of water from the fractured ceiling and the distant, mournful cry of a seagull. Arthur drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering a single word over and over again, a soft, questioning plea. "Eleanor." Each time he said it, a fresh stab of guilt and sorrow went through David. He had saved the man's life only to condemn him to this. Sarah, ever practical, took stock of their resources. They had 4 bottles of water left, a half-eaten bag of pretzels, a box of granola bars, and a bag of apples that the kids had been snacking on before the storm. It was a pathetic inventory for a family of 5. She rationed it out, giving each of the children and David half a granola bar and a few sips of water. She tried to get Arthur to take some water, but he turned his head away. Grief was a new weather system that had moved into their tiny shelter, just as powerful and destructive as the hurricane. It radiated from Arthur in cold, silent waves. He would lie for long periods, staring at the ceiling, his eyes vacant. Then, A memory would seem to surface, and his face would crumple, silent tears leaking from the corners of his eyes and tracing paths into his gray hair. Late in the afternoon, during a period of lucidity, he spoke. "She made blueberry pancakes," he said, his voice a dry rustle. He was looking at David, but his eyes were focused on a point 1,000 miles away. "This morning, or yesterday morning. Time's all mixed up. She always used the wild Maine blueberries. Said they had more flavor. We were sitting at the kitchen island, the granite one. She was laughing about something I said. Something stupid. I can't remember what it was. I can't remember." His voice broke, and he turned his face to the wall. David didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry" was a useless, pathetic phrase. He just sat there, a silent witness to the man's unraveling. The light began to fail, the gray of day slowly deepening into the charcoal of twilight. The world outside the broken doorway became a landscape of abstract, menacing shapes. The temperature dropped, and a damp chill seeped into the bathroom, raising goosebumps on their skin. They huddled together for warmth, a small island of humanity in an ocean of ruin. David knew he couldn't just sit here. Leadership wasn't a feeling, it was an action. While his family rested, his mind was at work, laying out the next boards. First, secure the shelter. The shattered opening to the bathroom was a liability. It let in the cold and offered no protection. He found the remains of the shower curtain and, using a piece of splintered wood, managed to tack it over the opening. It was a flimsy barrier, but it cut the wind and, more importantly, it blocked the view of the devastation outside. It allowed them the illusion of an interior, of a room, of a home. Second, water. Their bottled supply wouldn't last another day. The rainwater that had collected in pools and buckets all over the wreckage was their only hope, but it was full of filth and debris. He remembered a book he'd read about wilderness survival. He would need to build a filter. Sand, charcoal, cloth. Charcoal. He could get that from burned wood, if he could find any. He filed the thought away. A project for tomorrow. Third, reconnaissance. He had to know if they were truly alone. Were there other survivors? Was there a clear path to the main road? Was the bridge out? He couldn't risk taking his whole family on a blind trek through the ruins. Tomorrow, at first light, he would go out. Alone. He would scout, assess, and make a plan. The decision settled him. Having a plan, however fragile, was like having a foundation under your feet. It was a stay again. The chaos. He looked over at his family. Sarah had fallen into a fitful sleep, her head resting on a rolled-up towel, her arms still protectively wrapped around Leo and Mia, who were curled against her like puppies. Arthur was quiet, his breathing ragged but steady. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, there was a moment of stillness. David sat with his back against the cool tile of the wall, the heavy flashlight resting on his lap. He was the watchman. He listened to the strange new sounds of the night. The groan of stressed metal from a neighboring ruin, the scuttling of some unseen creature, the ceaseless, patient whisper of the ocean reclaiming the shore. He thought of Arthur's words. "I can't remember. It was the small things that haunted you. Not the grand gestures, but the taste of blueberries, the sound of a laugh, the warmth of a hand." He reached out in the near darkness and gently took Sarah's hand. Her fingers curled around his in her sleep. He held on tight, grounding himself in the simple, profound reality of her presence. The weight on his shoulders was still there, heavier than ever. But it was no longer just the abstract weight of leadership. It was the specific, tangible weight of these 4 lives, their heartbeats a soft rhythm in the darkness. It was the weight of Arthur's past and his children's future. It was a terrible, crushing burden. And he knew, with a certainty that was as solid as the concrete foundation of the house he had lost, that he would carry it for as long as he could. He would not fail them. He would build them a way out. One board at a time. Chapter 5, The Long Dawn. The night was a living thing. It breathed in the damp, cool air that slipped through the shower curtain, and it exhaled in the soft, rhythmic sighs of his sleeping family. David sat sentinel, his back pressed against the cold, unyielding porcelain of the bathtub, the dead weight of the flashlight a comfort in his lap. He was a lighthouse keeper on an island of tile and grout, and the ocean was a silent, fathomless darkness that had swallowed the world. Sleep was a distant country to which he had lost his passport. Every time his eyelids grew heavy, a fresh image would flash behind them. The sickening grind of Arthur's leg, the vacant stare in Eleanor's eyes, the splintered skeleton of the home he had raised from nothing. So he stayed awake, listening. He learned the new nocturnal symphony of their ruin, the groan of twisted lumber settling, the faint, metallic creak of the wind worrying a loose piece of flashing somewhere on the ghost of their roof, the impossibly loud drip, drip, drip of water falling from a fractured pipe into a hidden pool, each drop a tick of a clock counting down their survival. He rationed the flashlight, clicking it on only for a few seconds every quarter hour to scan their tiny domain. In the brief, stark cone of light, he would see them. Sarah, her face etched with a weariness that sleep could not erase, one arm slung over Leo, the other still loosely holding Mia. Her fingers would twitch, as if she were mending the fabric of their lives even in her dreams. The children were huddled into her, their faces slack with the profound innocence of slumber, a sight so achingly normal it felt like a dagger in his heart. And Arthur, a long, still form on the makeshift stretcher, a monument to the storm's casual cruelty. His breathing was shallow, a faint rasp in the quiet, but it was steady. He was alive. For now, that was a victory. In these long, silent hours, David the Builder reemerged. Not the builder of homes, but the builder of futures, however small and uncertain. His mind, unable to rest, began to lay foundations, to frame walls, to plot the architecture of the next 24 hours. Reconnaissance, the word was a solid, dependable beam in the chaos of his thoughts. He had to see. He had to know the shape of their prison. The first hint of dawn was not a light, but a lessening of the dark. The absolute black outside the shower curtain softened to a deep charcoal gray. The world was slowly gaining dimension, its jagged edges emerging from the gloom. It was time. He moved with a practiced quiet, a skill learned from years of rising before the sun to head to a job site without waking the kids. He eased himself to his feet, his joints protesting with a chorus of creaks and pops. He located his work boots, still caked in mud, and pulled them on, lacing them tight. Armor for the journey ahead. He checked their supplies, 3.5 bottles of water, a handful of granola bars, the pathetic bag of pretzels. He took nothing. These were for them. He would find more. He had to. He paused at the threshold, the tattered shower curtain. He looked back at his family, a small, vulnerable knot of humanity asleep on the floor of a bathroom. Leaving them felt like tearing a part of himself away. Every instinct screamed at him to stay, to guard this tiny, fragile space. But the logic of survival was a cold and brutal calculus. To protect them, he had to leave them. He slipped a hand into Sarah's, her skin warm and soft. Her eyes fluttered open, instantly lucid, the way a mother's always are. "David?" she whispered, her voice thick with sleep. "I have to go out," he breathed, his voice low. "I have to see how bad it is. I need to find water." Panic flickered in her eyes, a tiny flame in the dim light. "Don't. It's not safe. It's not safe in here, either," he countered gently. "Not for long. The water won't last the day. I'll be careful. I'll stay close. I just need to see the lay of the land." She searched his face in the gloom, and whatever she saw there, desperation, determination, a flicker of the man she had married who could fix anything, seemed to satisfy her. She squeezed his hand, a silent transfer of strength, of trust, of terror. "Be back before the kids wake up," she whispered. It was not a command, but a prayer. "I will," he promised, a lie he hoped he could make true. He slipped through the curtain and into the gray, broken world. The air outside was thick with the smells of the apocalypse, the brine of the ocean, the rot of wet wood and sodden insulation, the sharp, metallic tang of sheared metal, and underlying it all, a cloying sweetness that he eventually, sickeningly, identified as the scent of decay. The world was a monochromatic etching in shades of gray. The rain had washed the sky clean, and what little light there was had a strange, pearlescent quality, illuminating a landscape of absolute ruin. His own home was unrecognizable. It was less a structure and more a geological event, a violent upthrust of lumber and drywall. He picked his way through the familiar yet alien territory of his living room, now an open-air obstacle course of overturned furniture and shattered glass. The family photos on the mantelpiece were gone. The children's drawings that had been taped to the refrigerator were gone. The little ceramic bird Sarah had loved was gone. The storm had not just destroyed their house, it had erased their life. He moved with caution, his senses on high alert. Every step was a calculation. A loose floor joist could give way. A tangle of wires could be live. A sheet of metal could shift and trap him. The world was a series of booby traps. He kept his head on a swivel, scanning the ruins of his neighbors' houses. The silence was the most unsettling thing. It was a deep, profound silence that felt heavier than sound, broken only by the cawing of a lone gull and the endless sigh of the surf. No cars, no voices, no dogs barking. It was the sound of a world holding its breath, or perhaps a world that had taken its last. His first objective was his own backyard. He scrambled over the collapsed rear wall, his hands gripping splintered 2x4s, and dropped into what had once been a neatly manicured lawn. Now it was a slurry of mud, sea wrack, and the detritus of his and his neighbors' lives. He saw a child's plastic bucket, a single garden gnome staring placidly at the sky, a barbecue grill bent into a piece of modernist sculpture. And then he saw it. The rain barrel. It was a simple, 50-gallon plastic drum he had set up under a downspout to collect water for Sarah's garden. It had been torn from its stand, but had miraculously landed upright, wedged between the stump of a fallen oak and the remains of their deck. It was almost full. He peered inside. The water was brown and murky, full of leaves and pine needles and roof grit, but it was water. Fresh water. He could filter it. He could boil it. A surge of triumphant relief, so powerful it almost buckled his knees, washed over him. It was the first good thing that had happened since the world ended. One board laid, he thought. Now the next. His small victory spurred him on. He needed to get a wider view. His street, Bayview Drive, was a coastal road that curved along the shoreline before connecting to the main causeway bridge back to the mainland. The bridge was the key. If it was standing, there was a way out. If not, he refused to complete the thought. The street was a war zone. Houses had been scoured from their foundations, leaving only concrete slabs littered with plumbing pipes sticking up like strange, metallic weeds. Other homes, like his own, were collapsed into heaps. A pickup truck lay on its roof, its wheels pointing accusingly at the sky. He moved down the center of the road. The asphalt ripped and buckled in places, a river of sand and debris covering it in others. He called out once, his voice sounding thin and foolish in the vast emptiness. "Hello? Is anyone here?" Only the wind answered, whistling through the skeleton of a shattered sunroom. At the end of the street, where the land rose to a small bluff overlooking the causeway, his heart sank. The bluff offered a panoramic view, and the view was of utter annihilation. The causeway bridge, the solid, dependable two-lane artery that connected their small island community to the world, was gone. Not damaged, not partially collapsed. Gone. A central section, 100 yards or more, had been simply erased, leaving two concrete piers standing like tombstones in the churning, slate-gray water. David stood there for a long time, the cold sea breeze whipping at his jacket. The rain barrel felt like a hollow victory now. They had water, yes, but they were trapped. He was standing on the edge of an island, a prison built by the storm. He stared at the gap, at the angry chop of the water, and a cold, heavy despair settled in his gut, a weight far greater than any granite slab. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the true, terrifying scale of their isolation. They were utterly, completely alone. Sarah woke to silence and the empty space beside her. A jolt of pure, cold fear shot through her, so intense it made her gasp. She sat bolt upright, her heart hammering against her ribs. The kids were still asleep. Arthur was a still form in the corner. But David was gone. The shower curtain, their flimsy door to the world, was slightly ajar, letting in a pale, morbid light. Be back before the kids wake up. His promise echoed in her mind. Her first instinct was a primal, animal urge to scream his name, to run out into the wreckage after him. She fought it down, forcing the panic back into its cage. She was not just Sarah anymore. She was the fortress, and the fortress could not crumble. She took a deep, shuddering breath and focused on the immediate. The children. They were her purpose, her anchor in this swirling vortex of fear. She gently smoothed the hair back from Leo's forehead. His brow was furrowed in his sleep, as if he were wrestling with bad dreams. Mia's thumb was still in her mouth, her face buried in Sarah's side. They were safe. For this moment, in this small, tiled room, they were safe. A low groan from the other side of the room broke the quiet. Arthur was stirring. His eyes, bleary and clouded with pain, fluttered open. He blinked slowly, trying to focus, his gaze traveling from the broken ceiling to the tiled walls and finally to her. Confusion warred with pain on his face. "Where?" he rasped, his voice a dry crackle. "You're in our home," Sarah said softly, moving to his side. "Well, what's left of it? You're safe." He tried to push himself up, and a sharp, agonizing cry escaped his lips. He fell back, his face turning a ghastly shade of white. His eyes darted down to his leg, now a monstrous, towel-wrapped bundle. The memory, the horror, came rushing back. "Eleanor," he breathed, the name a shard of glass in his throat. He looked at Sarah, his eyes wide with a desperate, dawning terror. "My wife. Eleanor. Did you see her? She was with me. Under the granite." Sarah knelt beside him, her heart aching. The moment David had dreaded had arrived, and he wasn't here. It was her burden to bear. She took his hand. It was cold and trembling. "Arthur," she began, her voice gentle but steady. She had to be honest. False hope was a cruelty they couldn't afford. "We found you. You were alone." The hope in his eyes died, extinguished in an instant. He stared at her, uncomprehending. No, she was right there. She was holding my hand. I felt her. "The storm," Sarah whispered, her words failing her. How could she articulate the sheer violence, the force that could tear a held hand away? But Arthur understood. The reality landed on him with the force of a physical blow. His face crumpled. It was not a loud, dramatic grief, but a silent, internal collapse. A single tear escaped from the corner of his eye and traced a path through the grime on his temple. He turned his head to the wall, his body shaking with silent, racking sobs. Sarah stayed with him, holding his hand, her own tears blurring her vision. She felt like an intruder on the most private and sacred of sorrows. She could offer no comfort, and, platitudes. All she could offer was her presence, a silent testament that he was not alone in his suffering. The world had taken everything from him, but for this moment, another human being was here, bearing witness to his pain. After a long time, his sobs subsided into ragged, hitching breaths. He didn't turn back to face her. "She hated storms," he said, his voice a muffled, broken thing against the wall. "Always did. She'd make hot chocolate. We'd light candles and play Scrabble. She always won. She knew all the two-letter words." He fell silent. Sarah found her own voice, a near whisper. "David and we'd watch movies with the kids. Build a pillow fort in the living room. They called it the Thunder Fort. A shared memory of a lost world hung in the air between them. They were strangers, bound together by a catastrophe that had ripped their lives to shreds. And in that moment of shared recollection, a fragile connection was forged. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice still muffled. "Sarah. My husband is David. The children are Leo and Mia." "Arthur," he said simply. My wife was Eleanor." He said her name as if it were a prayer, a spell to keep her memory from fading. Just then, Leo stirred. "Mommy," he mumbled, sitting up and rubbing his eyes. "I'm thirsty." His gaze fell on Arthur, and his face grew solemn. "Is the man okay?" "He's resting, sweetie," Sarah said, turning her full attention to her son, her voice shifting to a brighter, more reassuring tone. "And yes, you can have some water." She measured out a small amount into a plastic cup, her movements precise and careful. This was the new currency of their lives. She handed it to Leo, who drank it down in 3 quick gulps. Then she turned to Arthur. "You need to drink, Arthur. And you have to eat something." He turned his face back from the wall. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, but there was a flicker of something new in them. Resignation, perhaps. Or just the dull, animal instinct to survive. He nodded weakly. She helped him sit up slightly, propping his head and shoulders with their last clean towel. She held the cup to his lips, and he drank, the water spilling down his chin. Then she broke a granola bar in half and gave him a piece. He chewed it slowly, mechanically, without taste or enjoyment, but he ate it. It was a start. It was a choice, however small, to keep living. As she tended to him, with Leo watching her every move with wide, serious eyes, Sarah felt a subtle shift within herself. David was the builder, the planner, the one who ventured out. But she was the keeper of the fire, the keeper of their dwindling supplies, the keeper of their humanity. This small, broken room was her ship, and she would not let it sink. David would return. He had to. And when he did, he would find them ready. David's journey back was a descent into a different kind of hell. The initial shock of seeing the broken bridge had given way to a cold, pragmatic dread. The problem was no longer simply survival. It was escape. And there was no escape. He retraced his steps, his mind racing, cataloging every detail of the terrain, his builder's eye assessing not for beauty or function, but for resources and threats. The ruins were no longer just a testament to loss. They were a potential lumber yard, a scrap heap, a mine of materials. A collapsed wall was a source of wood for a fire. A piece of corrugated metal roofing could be a rain catcher or a shield. An abandoned car held gasoline, a battery, perhaps tools in its trunk. His perspective had shifted. He was no longer a resident of this world. He was a scavenger. He made his way to the house next door, or what was left of it. The Hendersons, a retired couple who had always had a perfectly manicured lawn. Their house had been built on a lower grade, closer to the water, and it had been obliterated. But their pantry, built into the more solid foundation at the back of the house, was partially intact. Using a piece of rebar as a crowbar, he pried at the jammed door. The wood splintered and groaned, and finally, with a loud crack, gave way. The inside was a chaotic mess of shattered jars and sodden boxes. But in the back, on a high shelf, a small cache had survived. Several cans of beans, a tin of tuna, a box of crackers in a sealed plastic sleeve, and a large, unopened plastic jug of spring water. It felt like discovering a pharaoh's tomb. He stared at the bounty, a lump forming in his throat. "Thank you, Martha Henderson," he thought, for being such a well-organized person. He found a sodden canvas beach bag in the wreckage and loaded his treasures. The weight was significant, but it was a good weight, the weight of a chance. One more day? Maybe 2. On his way out, he saw something half buried in the mud near the pantry door. It was a child's bicycle, a small, pink tricycle with faded handlebar streamers. The Hendersons' granddaughter, Sophie, used to ride it up and down the sidewalk when she visited. David remembered her laughing, the bell on the tricycle ringing, a bright, cheerful sound in the summer air. He stared at the small, mud-caked machine, and the weight of the cans on his back was suddenly replaced by a crushing, unbearable sorrow. It was the intimate, personal nature of the object that broke through his carefully constructed walls of pragmatism. This wasn't abstract devastation. This was Sophie's tricycle. This was Martha's pantry. This was Eleanor's hand being torn from Arthur's. He leaned against the shattered wall, the canvas bag digging into his shoulder, and for the first time since the storm hit, he allowed the tears to come. He wept silently, his body shaking, mourning not just for his home, but for all the small, beautiful, ordinary things that were gone forever. After a few minutes, he wiped his face with the back of his grimy hand. Grief was a luxury. He had a family to feed. He shouldered the bag, turned his back on the tricycle, and started the final, treacherous leg of his journey home. He approached the gaping wound of his own house with a knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. What if they weren't there? What if something had happened? He scrambled over the debris, calling out as he got closer. "Sarah, I'm back." The shower curtain was thrown aside, and her face appeared. The relief that flooded her features was so profound it was like the sun breaking through the clouds. "David." He stumbled into the bathroom, dropping the heavy bag on the floor with a thud. The small space was crowded, but it was warm and alive. The kids rushed to him, wrapping their arms around his legs. "Daddy, you came back," Leo cried. "You were gone a long time," Mia said, her voice a small accusation. He hugged them fiercely, burying his face in their hair, breathing in their scent. He looked over their heads at Sarah, and their eyes met in a long, silent exchange that said everything that words could not. I was terrified. I missed you. I'm so glad you're safe. Then he saw Arthur. He was propped up against the wall, a piece of granola bar in his hand. He looked gaunt and hollowed out, but his eyes were clear, and he met David's gaze with a look of quiet, shared understanding. "Welcome back," Arthur said, his voice weak but clear. The normality of the scene, his wife, his children, a guest being offered food, was so surreal, so at odds with the annihilated world just outside the curtain, that David felt a moment of dizzying dislocation. "I brought things," he said, his voice hoarse. He unzipped the bag and pulled out his treasures. The cans of beans, the tuna, the crackers, and finally, the large jug of water. Sarah gasped. Leo's eyes went wide. Real food. It was a feast. It was a future. The mood in the tiny room lifted, buoyed by the simple, miraculous presence of sealed food and clean water. For a while, they just savored the victory. Sarah carefully opened the box of crackers and gave one to each of the children, who ate them with a reverence usually reserved for birthday cake. She poured a small amount of the clean water for everyone. Even Arthur managed a small, sad smile. But David knew he couldn't hold back the rest of the news. The small hope he had brought back had to be tempered with the large, terrible truth. He waited until the children were distracted, examining the labels on the cans, and then he looked at Sarah. "The water barrel is full," he said quietly, starting with the good. "Dirty, but we can filter it. There's food in some of the other pantries. We can scavenge. We can survive here. For a while." "But," Sarah prompted, already hearing the unspoken part of his sentence. David took a deep breath. "The bridge is gone, Sarah. The whole middle section. It's just gone. There's no way off the island." The small bubble of relief and hope in the room popped. The silence that followed was heavier than before, weighted with the new, stark reality of their situation. The children felt it, too. They stopped their playing and looked from David's grim face to their mother's. Sarah didn't cry. Her face seemed to harden, to set like concrete. She stared at the tiled floor for a long moment, processing the information. When she looked up, her eyes were clear and fierce. "So we're trapped," she said. It wasn't a question. David nodded. She looked at the children, at Arthur, at the small store of food on the floor. Her gaze was that of a general surveying her troops and her resources before a long and difficult siege. "Okay," she said, her voice devoid of any tremor. "Okay, so we're not leaving. This is home now. What's the next step, David? What's the next board you lay?" David looked at his wife, at her impossible, unyielding strength, and he felt his own resolve solidify. The despair he had felt on the bluff was a poison, but her courage was the antidote. She was right. Wasting time on what was lost was a death sentence. They had to build with what they had. "First," he said, his voice finding its old, confident rhythm, the voice of a man who builds things that last. "We make this place safer. We reinforce this room. Then, we build a water filter. I saw what we need. Then, we organize a real supply depot. We plan. We work. We survive. Right here." He looked around the small, cramped bathroom, at the four faces staring back at him, their lives in his hands. "We build a life, one day at a time, until someone comes for us." It was an impossible plan, a promise built on a foundation of hope as fragile as a spider's web. But as he said it, looking at his family, at this small, determined tribe huddled together in the ruins of the world, he knew it was the only plan that mattered. The dawn had been long and terrible, but it had finally broken. And now, the work of living could begin. Chapter 6. The Architecture of Survival. The day began not with a sunrise, but with a meeting of the board. The board consisted of 2 voting members, David and Sarah, huddled over a makeshift table, an overturned plastic storage bin, in the cramped confines of the bathroom. The agenda was singular and absolute. Tomorrow. The minutes were kept in the tense lines around their eyes. Breakfast was a solemn ritual. Sarah, the quartermaster of their meager stores, opened the tin of tuna David had scavenged. She used the lid, carefully bent back, to divide the contents into 5 impossibly small portions on the precious crackers. 1 for each child, 1 for Arthur, 1 for herself, and 1 for David. The jug of clean water was treated with the reverence of a holy relic, small amounts measured into the single plastic cup they had. "We eat half of this now," Sarah stated, her voice low and firm, a general briefing her command staff. "The rest is for dinner. The cans of beans are for tomorrow. We don't touch them today unless it's a dire emergency." David nodded, chewing the cracker and tuna with a slow, deliberate motion that belied the hunger clawing at his stomach. The salty, oily taste was the most luxurious thing he had ever experienced. "Agreed. Today's work requires fuel, but we need to make this last." He looked at the small pile of cans and granola bars. It was a pathetic bulwark against starvation. Leo, ever the pragmatist in miniature, watched the division with the keen eye of a hawk. "Is that all?" he asked, not as a complaint, but as a simple assessment of fact. "It's enough to make you strong for today, buddy," David said, ruffling his hair. "And today, we have big work to do." Mia, curled in Sarah's lap, nibbled her cracker with the delicacy of a mouse, her wide eyes taking in the gravity of her parents' faces. She understood little of strategy, but everything of tone, and the tone in the room was one of fragile, dangerous purpose. Across the small space, Arthur accepted his portion from Sarah with a murmured thanks. The raw, abject grief of the previous day had receded, leaving behind a profound and terrible emptiness in his eyes. He ate mechanically, his gaze fixed on the tiled wall, a man going through the motions of living while his soul was elsewhere. Yet he ate. That, Sarah knew, was a victory. "Okay," David said, wiping his hands on his dusty jeans and lowering his voice so the children wouldn't fully grasp the details. "The plan. Step 1 is water. I'm going to get that rain barrel, bring it closer, and build a filter. I saw what I need. Charcoal from the Henderson's barbecue, sand from the wash-up on the road, a bucket. It won't be perfect, but if we boil it after, it'll be safe." Sarah nodded. "While you're doing that, I'll organize. We can't stay in here. It's too small. We're tripping over each other. It's not defensible if—" She didn't finish the sentence. If what? If wild animals came? If desperate people came? The possibilities were a dark abyss she refused to peer into for long. "No, we can't," David agreed. "I was thinking about that on the way back. The laundry room and the pantry. They're in the center of the house. No exterior walls. The roof above them is gone, but the ceiling joists are mostly intact, and the collapsed second floor is piled on top. It's like a cave, a bunker. It's the strongest part of what's left." "The tomb," Sarah whispered, an involuntary shudder running through her. David's eyes softened. "The fortress," he corrected gently. "We just have to clear it out. Make it our own." "What about me?" a quiet voice asked. They both turned to Arthur. He was looking at them, a flicker of something, shame, perhaps, at his own helplessness, in his hollow eyes. "I can't haul or build. But I can't just lie here." Before David could formulate a diplomatic response, Sarah spoke. "You can be the watchtower, Arthur. You can watch the children. Here, in this room. Keep them safe while we work. Keep them calm." She paused, then added, "Tell them stories. Distract them. That's more important than any wall we could build." A flicker of the man he used to be surfaced in Arthur's expression. He was, David recalled vaguely, a retired English professor from the local college. A man of words and stories. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. "A storyteller," he said, his voice raspy. "Yes, I suppose I can still do that." The plan was set. The architecture of their survival had its blueprint. Now, they had to build. David moved through the ruins of his home with a grim efficiency. The grief was still there, a cold stone in his gut, but he walled it off, compartmentalized it behind the immediate, pressing needs of physics and engineering. His first task was retrieving the rain barrel. It was a clumsy, 50-gallon beast, and nearly full. It must have weighed over 400 pounds. He couldn't move it. He scavenged. In the wreckage of his own garage, he found a length of garden hose. Siphoning. A high school trick he hadn't thought of in 20 years. He got the hose started, the foul, gritty taste of the water making him gag, and then washed with immense satisfaction as the brown water gurgled into a collection of smaller, manageable containers he'd found. 2 paint buckets, a plastic wastebasket, and Sarah's largest stockpot, miraculously intact in the pantry rubble. He hauled the containers, one by one, back to the relative safety of the bathroom's exterior wall, his muscles burning with the effort. It was back-breaking labor, but with every sloshing bucket he carried, he felt a primal sense of provision. He was a hunter-gatherer in a concrete jungle, and this was his kill. Next, the filter. He found the Henderson's overturned barbecue, its metal hood twisted into a grotesque smile. He smashed the bag of charcoal briquettes into a fine powder with a rock. He scooped buckets of sand and fine gravel from a drift that had piled up where the driveway used to be. His final component was one of his own torn T-shirts, which he washed as best he could in a puddle. He assembled the device with the focus of a scientist. A 5-gallon bucket, with a small hole punched in the bottom. He layered it carefully. A piece of the T-shirt as a primary screen, a thick layer of sand, a dense stratum of powdered charcoal, more sand, and finally a topping of gravel to disperse the water. It was a crude, ugly thing, a contraption of trash and desperation. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever built. He poured the first container of barrel water into the filter. It sank into the gravel, and for a long minute, nothing happened. He felt a stab of doubt. Then, a slow, steady drip began to fall from the hole in the bottom, splashing into the clean stockpot below. The water was still faintly tinged with yellow, but it was a world away from the murky, debris-filled liquid he had poured in the top. It was clearer. It was hope distilled. "David," Sarah's voice called from the house. "Come see." He left his filter to its slow, rhythmic work and picked his way back inside. He found her standing in the narrow hallway between the laundry room and the pantry. The area was, as he'd said, a small, protected cavern. The ceiling was low and solid, and the debris from the collapsed floor above formed thick, insulating walls on two sides. But the space itself was a disaster zone. Sodden boxes of ruined food had split open, coating the floor in a foul-smelling paste of what might have been oatmeal and flour. Broken jars of pickles and jam added their own sicky sweet, vinegary stench to the air. Shards of glass littered the floor like vicious, sparkling jewels. Sarah, however, was not looking at the mess. She was looking at a small square of white on the one intact plaster wall. It was a child's drawing, taped to the wall long ago. A crayon rendering of a wobbly, smiling sun, beaming down on a lopsided house, and four stick figures holding hands. Mia's work. In the midst of the destruction, the damp, and the decay, the drawing had survived. Its cheerful, innocent colors were a defiant scream against the monochrome gray of their new world. "It's a sign," Sarah whispered, her voice thick. "This is the place. This is home." David looked at the drawing, at his wife's face illuminated by the dim light filtering through the wreckage, and felt a surge of love so fierce it almost hurt. She had the soul of a homesteader, the ability to see a future in the most barren of landscapes. "Okay," he said, his voice catching slightly. "Let's clear it out." The work was brutal. They had no proper tools, only their hands and a few sturdy pieces of splintered wood to use as scrapers and levers. They shoveled the putrid mush of ruined food into a bucket, making trip after trip to dump it in a far corner of the wreckage. They swept the glass into a pile with a piece of cardboard. Sarah worked with a focused intensity that matched his own, her face set in a grim mask of determination, pausing only to wring out the rag she was using to wipe down the shelves. Slowly, painstakingly, they carved a clean, livable space out of the chaos. It was no bigger than a large closet, a 10 by 10-foot square of concrete floor and bare shelves. But it was dry. It was solid. It was theirs. While they worked, the sound of Arthur's voice drifted from the bathroom, a low, steady murmur. He was making good on his promise. He was telling a story. And so Odysseus and his men found themselves on the island of the Cyclops. Arthur's voice floated down the ruined hall, thin but resonant. A great, one-eyed monster named Polyphemus, who knew nothing of hospitality, and saw the men only as his next meal. Leo, captivated, sat cross-legged on the floor, his chin in his hands. Mia was curled beside him, lulled by the rhythm of the old man's voice. Arthur spoke of monsters and heroes, of clever tricks and desperate escapes, of a long, treacherous journey home. He was not just distracting the children. He was giving them a language for their own experience, a framework of myth and legend to contain the formless, overwhelming horror of their reality. He was arming them with stories. By late afternoon, the new space was ready. David had found several large, flat pieces of plywood in the debris and laid them on the concrete floor, creating a raised platform that would keep them off the damp ground. Sarah had scrubbed the shelves clean and was arranging their meager supplies of food and water with meticulous care. It looked less like a pantry and more like an altar. The final, and most difficult, task was moving Arthur. His leg was a dead, heavy weight, and every slight jostle sent a spasm of pain through him. David and Sarah improvised a stretcher from a small interior door they'd pulled from a shattered frame. With infinite care, they eased him onto it. Arthur, his face pale and beaded with sweat, bit his lip to keep from crying out. "All right, Professor," David grunted, taking the front of the door. "Time for the next chapter of the journey." The trip down the short, debris-strewn hallway was agonizingly slow. Leo and Mia trailed behind, their faces etched with concern, carrying the blankets and the single flashlight like a solemn procession. They were a tribe, a clan, migrating from one cave to another. They settled Arthur in a corner of the new room, propping him up against the wall on a pile of blankets. Sarah immediately gave him 2 of the precious aspirin they had in their first aid kit, and a cup of the newly filtered, boiled water. As the gray afternoon light began to fade, their new home was complete. The space was cramped, windowless, and smelled faintly of damp concrete and antiseptic wipes. But it was a fortress. The entrance was a narrow gap in the debris that could be easily blocked. The thick, rubble-filled walls on either side would muffle any sound and provide insulation. Their supplies were organized, their sleeping pallets laid out. On the wall, above the pathetic little larder, Mia's crayon sun shone down on them. That evening, they ate their dinner, the other half of the tuna and crackers, in their new home. A profound, bone-deep exhaustion had settled over all of them, but it was the good exhaustion that comes after a day of hard, meaningful work. "We did it," Sarah said quietly, leaning her head against David's shoulder. The children were already asleep, huddled together under a blanket. "We built a home." "The first one," David murmured, wrapping an arm around her. "Strongest one I've ever framed." He looked at the small space, at the sleeping forms of his children, at the quiet, breathing stillness of his wife. He looked at Arthur, who was staring at the drawing on the wall, his expression unreadable. For the first time in 2 days, David felt a flicker not of hope. That was too large, too fragile a word, but of possibility. The possibility of another day. They had imposed order on chaos. They had carved a space for life out of a landscape of death. They had survived the day, and they had a plan for the next one. As darkness consumed what was left of the world outside their tiny sanctuary, a deep and unfamiliar silence settled. The wind had died down, and the constant groaning of the house's broken skeleton had ceased. The only sounds were the soft breathing of his family and the steady, reassuring drip, drip, drip of his water filter, which he had moved just outside their new door, dutifully performing its vital work. David allowed himself to relax, his body sinking into the hard plywood floor. Sarah was already drifting off to sleep, her hand still resting on his arm. He closed his eyes, the weariness pulling at him like a physical tide. He would sleep tonight. He had earned it. The fortress was secure. And then he heard it. It started so faintly he thought it was in his head, a phantom rhythm born of exhaustion. Thump. A pause. Long enough to make him think he'd imagined it. Thump. He sat bolt upright, his heart instantly hammering. His eyes shot open, scanning the absolute darkness of their shelter. Sarah stirred beside him. "What is it?" she whispered. "Shoo," he breathed, holding up a hand, straining to listen. There it was again, louder this time, or was the silence just deeper? Thump, thump, thump. It was a low, resonant, percussive sound. It was heavy. It was rhythmic, as steady as a metronome. It was coming from somewhere outside, carried on the damp night air. It wasn't the sound of nature, not the sea or the wind or settling rubble. It was methodical. It was mechanical. It was the sound of something working. He felt the fine hairs on his arms stand up. The fragile sense of security he had built all day, board by painful board, shattered into a million pieces. The silence had been a comfort, a sign of their isolation. But this sound meant they were not alone. Across the small, dark space, he saw 2 pinpricks of light reflect from the flashlight's beam. Arthur was awake, too, and he was listening. Thump, thump, thump. The sound echoed through the ruins, a slow, deliberate heartbeat in the corpse of the world. And in the suffocating darkness of their newly built fortress, David was suddenly, terribly afraid. Chapter 7. The Heartbeat of the World. The sound was an invasion. It breached the carefully constructed walls of their sanctuary, not with force, but with insidious, rhythmic persistence. It seeped through the rubble, vibrated up through the concrete floor, and settled deep in the cavity of David's chest. Thump, thump, thump. He remained motionless, a statue carved from tension, every muscle coiled. Beside him, Sarah was equally rigid, her hand gripping his arm with a strength that belied her slender frame. Her breathing was a shallow whisper in the dark, Across the small space, Arthur's silhouette was barely visible, propped against the wall, his head cocked, listening with an unnerving stillness. The children, blessedly, remained asleep, their small bodies tangled together in the innocent oblivion of exhaustion. "What is it?" Sarah's voice was barely a breath, a ghost of a sound meant only for him. "I don't know," David whispered back, his own voice raspy. He strained his ears, trying to dissect the noise, to give it a name and therefore a shape, a limit. It was too slow for an engine, too regular for falling debris. It was heavy, a profound, gut-thrumming bass note. It sounded like something immense and tireless, a giant pounding a slow, deliberate drum. Thump, thump, thump. The metronomic regularity was the most terrifying part. It spoke of a machine, of a purpose. Randomness was the law of this new world, the chaotic shatter of a window, the unpredictable groan of settling wreckage. But this was order. And in the dead silence of their ruined neighborhood, order was an alien and threatening concept. It meant there was another will at work in the world, one with power, one with a purpose that did not include them. "Maybe it's far out." "Why?" Sarah offered, a fragile strand of hope in her whisper. "Sounds scary at night." "Maybe," David conceded, though he didn't believe it. The sound felt closer than that. He could almost feel the impact in his teeth. It was a pressure wave, not just an auditory event. He imagined a great metal fist, rising and falling in the darkness, pulverizing concrete, smashing through the ruins with methodical indifference. He thought of the stories he'd read, the ones people always dismissed as paranoia. Tales of desperate gangs building crude battering rams to breach shelters, of scavengers using salvaged equipment to tear apart buildings for anything of value. His mind, a traitor in the dark, painted vivid pictures of faceless men, their features hardened by disaster, working under the cold light of a single bulb powered by a noisy generator. But there was no generator sound, only the pure, clean, terrifying thump. Hours crawled by. The sound did not stop, did not slow, did not change its rhythm. It became the new silence, the baseline of their existence. Every other small noise, a child's sigh in their sleep, the rustle of a blanket, the drip of the water filter just outside, was a brief interruption to the dominant, unending heartbeat. David found he couldn't lie down. He sat with his back against the rough plywood, his arms wrapped around his knees, a sentry at the gates of a fortress that suddenly felt as fragile as a house of cards. He was a creature of the light, an architect who understood stress loads and support beams, a man who built things that stood up. This darkness, filled with this incomprehensible sound, was an equation he could not solve. All his practical skills, his desperate engineering of the past 2 days, felt like a child's game in the face of this unknown power. At some point, Arthur's voice, low and raspy, cut through the darkness. "It sounds like a pile driver." David turned his head. "What?" "Or a large displacement pump." "A positive displacement pump," Arthur clarified, his voice holding the faint, dusty echo of a lecture hall. "They're used in civil engineering, for dewatering deep excavations, or in oil fields. They have a slow, powerful, rhythmic stroke. Thump like that. Pushing fluid." David's mind latched onto the words. A pump. Pushing water. Why would anyone be pumping water out here? The entire town was half submerged. It made no sense. Yet, the explanation, as arcane as it was, felt more real than his fevered imaginings of marauders. It was still terrifying, but it was a known terror. It was engineering, not savagery. "A pump for what?" Sarah asked from the darkness. "I don't know," Arthur admitted. "But it is a sound of work. Of industry. Not chaos." His words hung in the air. A sound of work. For the first time, a sliver of a different possibility, thin and sharp as a shard of glass, lodged itself in David's mind. What if the purpose wasn't malicious? What if it wasn't even indifferent? What if? He didn't dare complete the thought. Hope was a more dangerous thing than fear. Fear kept you alert, but hope could make you careless. The long, dark hours of the vigil finally gave way to a slow dilution of the blackness. A faint, gray, spectral light began to filter through the cracks in the debris high above, turning their pitch-dark cavern into a tomb of shadows and shapes. With the light came no relief. The sound was still there, a monstrous, waking pulse. If anything, it seemed louder in the thin morning air, more real and tangible. Leo stirred first, then Mia. They sat up, rubbing their eyes, instantly aware of the oppressive rhythm. "What's that banging?" Leo asked, his voice sharp with a child's directness. "It's just a noise, sweetie," Sarah said, her voice a practiced calm that David knew cost her a universe of effort. "It's far away." "It's not," Leo stated, with the unassailable logic of a boy who trusted his senses. "It's close. I can feel it in the floor." David knew a decision had been made for him. He couldn't keep his family huddled in a cave, cowering from a sound. To live in fear of the unknown was to surrender. He had not rebuilt a corner of his world just to let it become a prison. He had to know. He had to see. He got to his feet, his joints protesting. He looked at Sarah. Her eyes, wide and dark in the gloom, were already pleading with him. "I'm going out," he said, his voice low and firm. "Just to look. I won't go far. I'll be careful." "No," she breathed, shaking her head. "David, don't. We're safe here. We have water. We have food for a day or two. Why would you?" "Because we can't live like this," he interrupted, his voice gentle but inflexible. "We can't hide from a sound. I have to know what it is. If it's a threat, we need to know. If it's something else, we need to know that, too." He looked at the children, their faces pale and upturned, then at Arthur, who simply watched him with an expression of grim understanding. "I'm the only one who can go." The argument was over before it began. They both knew it. This was his role. The architect, the builder, the scout. Sarah's role was to guard the hearth, to keep the center strong. She nodded, a single, sharp movement of her chin. The debate was done. Now came the logistics of survival. She moved to their small larder and took out a granola bar, a precious commodity, and a small plastic bottle of the filtered, boiled water. "Take this," she said, her voice all business now. "Don't be a hero. See what it is, and come right back. Don't talk to anyone unless you have to. Don't let them see you if you can help it." "I won't," he promised, tucking the items into his pocket. He knelt and kissed Mia's forehead, then ruffled Leo's hair. "Be brave for your mom," he said. "Are you going to fight the monster?" Mia asked, her voice small. David looked from her to the gray light of the opening. "I'm just going to see if it's a monster at all." He turned to Arthur. "Keep them safe." The old professor met his gaze. "The story of Odysseus is not yet over," Arthur said, a strange, faint smile on his lips. "He always returns to his family." With that, David squeezed Sarah's hand one last time, turned, and slipped out of the narrow opening of their fortress, leaving the warmth and the fear behind him and stepping into the cold, gray, thumping world. The air outside was cold and damp, thick with the smell of wet concrete, rot, and the distant, briny tang of the sea. The rhythmic thumping was immediately louder, a physical blow to his senses. He could now pinpoint its direction with more certainty. It was coming from the northeast, towards the old commercial wharf and the main road that led out of town. It was a good half-mile away, at least. He moved with a caution that was becoming second nature, sticking to the skeletal remains of walls, using piles of rubble for cover. The world was a labyrinth of ruin. His own home, the Hendersons, the Gar. Sias. They were no longer houses, but abstract sculptures of destruction, their familiar geometries twisted into unrecognizable shapes. He saw a child's tricycle, its front wheel bent at a sickening angle, half buried in mud and shingles. He saw a photograph album, swollen and ruined, its pages of smiling ghosts open to the weeping sky. Each step was a walk through a graveyard of memories. He kept his focus on the sound. Thump, thump, thump. It was his compass needle, pulling him forward. He crossed what used to be Crestview Lane, now a shallow, debris-choked canal of stagnant brown water. He waded through it, the frigid water seeping into his boots, and clambered up the other side. As he got closer, a new sound began to weave itself around the first. A low, powerful hum. A generator. So there was power. The image of organized scavengers returned, sharper this time. But the sound of the generator wasn't the sputtering roar of a portable construction unit. It was deeper, smoother, more substantial. He reached the edge of the residential cul-de-sac and peered over a mountain of debris that had once been the Wilsons' two-story colonial. Before him lay the main road, or what was left of it. And beyond that, the commercial area. He could see it now. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a band of scavengers. It wasn't some crude, improvised machine. It was a scene of staggering, impossible order. There were vehicles, not civilian cars, but huge, olive-drab trucks with military markings. There were men, dozens of them, moving with a calm, unhurried purpose. Some were in camouflage uniforms, others in bright yellow rain slickers and white hard hats. They were ants, swarming over the corpse of the town, but they were not devouring it. They were clearing it. And there was the source of the sound. It was a colossal pump, a monstrous thing of blue-painted steel and thick, ribbed hoses the width of a man's torso. A diesel generator the size of a small car hummed beside it, powering the beast. One massive hose snaked down into the flooded intersection of the main road, its intake submerged in the brown water. Another, even larger hose led away, over the wreckage, towards the sea. And in the center of the machine, a massive piston rose and fell within a hydraulic cylinder, its movement slow, powerful, and inexorable. Thump! The piston drove down, and a great shudder ran through the machine. Thump! It drove down again, forcing thousands of gallons of floodwater through the hose and out to sea. Thump! David stared, his mind struggling to process the scale of it. He had spent 2 days building a water filter out of a bucket, charcoal, and a t-shirt. These men were moving the ocean itself. He had cleared a 10 by 10 foot space with his bare hands. They were moving houses with bulldozers and front-end loaders that sat parked nearby, silent for the moment, but potent with latent power. This was not a group of survivors. This was the world, returning. This was the cavalry. He felt a dizzying wave of vertigo, a sense of profound and crushing insignificance. His desperate, all-consuming struggle for survival. The tuna can, the plywood floor, the precious granola bar in his pocket. It was all a frantic scrabbling in the dirt while, just half a mile away, civilization was reasserting itself with thunderous, mechanical force. A sob of relief, so powerful it was almost painful, tore from his throat. He choked it back, pressing his fist to his mouth. Tears blurred his vision, turning the scene into a hazy mirage of yellow slickers and green trucks. They were not alone. They had never been completely alone. Help had been on its way. He slid down from his perch, his legs suddenly weak. He needed to get back. He needed to tell Sarah. He started to move, but a voice cut through the air, sharp and authoritative. Hold it. Right there. Hands where I can see them. David froze, his heart leaping into his throat. He slowly raised his hands. 2 soldiers, clad in full combat gear, their faces grim under their helmets, were advancing on him, their rifles held at a low ready. They had appeared from behind a wrecked delivery van, moving with a silent efficiency that was terrifying. On your knees, the first one commanded. David knelt in the mud, his mind reeling. Of all the things he had feared, being seen as a threat by his own rescuers was not one of them. He was a ghost who had just stumbled out of a tomb, and to these men, he was just another unpredictable variable in a disaster zone. I'm a survivor, he said, his voice cracking. My family were in my house. What's left of it? The soldiers stopped a few feet from him, their rifles still trained on his chest. One of them, younger, with sharp blue eyes, kept him covered while the other, a sergeant with a weathered face, spoke into a radio on his shoulder. Got a civilian here, Sector 4. Male, about 40. Claims to have a family. A crackle of static, then a voice. Copy that, Sergeant. Bring him in. Cautiously, the sergeant looked at David, his eyes assessing, missing nothing. The dirt, the exhaustion, the raw desperation etched into his face. All right, pal. On your feet. Slowly. You're going to walk with us. My family, David repeated, his voice pleading. My wife, my 2 kids, an old man. They're back there. They're waiting for me. They're scared. The sergeant's expression softened, just a fraction. We'll get to them. First, you come with us. Let's go. They escorted him, one in front, one behind, across the ruined road and into the heart of the operation. It was even more overwhelming up close. A command tent had been set up, with maps and radios. A makeshift infirmary was already treating a few people with minor injuries. A line of exhausted-looking survivors, wrapped in gray blankets, sat on a bench, their faces numb with shock. They looked like him. He was led to a man with a clipboard and a weary, compassionate face. He wore a jacket with FEMA printed on the back. Name? The man asked, his voice tired but kind. David Miller. Okay, David. Where have you been holed up? My house. 714, Willow Creek Court. Or what's left of it. He gestured vaguely back into the maze of wreckage he had just navigated. My wife, Sarah. My kids, Leo and Mia. And a neighbor, Arthur. The man made notes on his clipboard. Are any of you injured? Arthur. His leg is broken. Badly. We have some clean water, but we're almost out of food. The man nodded, his expression unchanging. He had heard this story, or one very much like it, 100 times. Okay, David. We've got a search team ready to deploy. You're going to lead them back to your family. He looked up and met David's eyes. You did good, getting them through this. Now let us take it from here. The walk back was surreal. He was no longer a solitary scout, but the guide for a rescue party. 2 soldiers and a paramedic with a heavy-looking orange paw. CK followed him. They moved with a speed and confidence that made his own earlier, cautious progress seem pathetic. They communicated with hand signals, their eyes constantly scanning the ruins. As they neared the remains of his house, David's heart began to pound. What if something had happened? What if Sarah had thought the worst? He scrambled up the final pile of rubble and looked towards the narrow opening of their fortress. Sarah, he yelled, his voice raw. It's me. I'm back. I've brought help. The silence that followed was terrifying. It stretched for a single, agonizing second. Then, Sarah's face appeared in the gap. Her hair was matted, her face smudged with dirt, but to David, she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Her eyes widened, first at the sight of him, then at the uniformed figures behind him. A complex storm of emotions washed over her face. Relief, disbelief, fear, and then, finally, a deep, shuddering release. She stumbled out into the gray light, and he ran to meet her, wrapping her in his arms. She buried her face in his shoulder and began to sob, not with grief, but with the profound, bone-deep exhaustion of a soldier whose war was finally over. The evacuation was a blur of efficient, compassionate activity. The paramedic, a woman named Corporal Jessup, went in first. David heard her calm, reassuring voice speaking to the children and to Arthur. Within minutes, the soldiers had cleared a wider path to the shelter. Leo and Mia emerged, blinking in the daylight, their small hands clutching each other's. Leo stared at the soldiers with wide, analytical eyes, while Mia immediately ran and hid behind Sarah's legs, peeking out at the strangers. The most difficult part was moving Arthur. The soldiers in Jessup were practiced and gentle. They had a proper collapsible stretcher. They eased him out of the cramped space, and Jessup immediately began to assess his leg, cutting away the trouser leg to reveal the bruised, swollen mess beneath. "You've got a nasty fracture here, sir," she said to Arthur, her voice calm and professional. "But you've kept it clean. That's good. We're going to get you somewhere warm and get that set properly." Arthur, his face pale with pain, simply nodded, his eyes welling with tears. He looked at David. "Odysseus has returned," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "And he brought the fleet with him." As they prepared to leave, Sarah ducked back into the shelter one last time. She emerged a moment later holding a small, slightly damp square of paper. It was Mia's crayon drawing of the wobbly sun and the stick figure family. With infinite care, she folded it and tucked it into her pocket. They were leaving the fortress, but they were taking the foundation with them. They were led away from the wreckage of their lives, a small, bedraggled tribe absorbed into a larger, more powerful one. They were given thick wool blankets and hot, sweet tea in styrofoam cups that felt like the height of luxury. Arthur was loaded onto an amphibious transport vehicle, Jessup at his side. The rest of them were guided towards one of the big military trucks. Before he climbed in, David paused and looked back one last time. He saw the ruins of his home, the place where he had built his life, raised his children, and then, in its death throes, built a fortress to save them. He saw the overturned barbecue, the siphoning hose, the ugly, beautiful water filter still standing sentinel, its slow work now redundant. They were just objects, trash in a wasteland. But for 2 days, they had been the architecture of survival. They had been everything. He climbed into the back of the truck, the heavy canvas flap closing them into a dim, rumbling twilight. Sarah was already there, with Mia on her lap and Leo tucked under her arm. He sat down beside her, the hard metal bench a welcome comfort. The engine roared to life, and the truck lurched forward, carrying them away. Away from the wreckage, away from the fear, towards an unknown future. They had lost their home, their possessions, their neighborhood, the entire geography of their lives. They were refugees, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a child's drawing in a pocket. But as the truck rumbled over the broken roads, David reached out and took Sarah's hand. Her fingers laced with his, a familiar, reassuring pressure. Mia, lulled by the motion, was falling asleep, her small head resting on Sarah's chest. Leo leaned against David's side, finally allowing his own exhaustion to show. David looked at his family, huddled together in the rocking darkness of the truck. They were bruised, tired, and stripped of everything, but they were whole. They were together. The terrible, crushing weight of absolute responsibility he had been carrying for 2 days began to lift, replaced by a profound, quiet gratitude. The fortress had not been the pantry, or the plywood floor, or the scavenged food. It had been this small circle of hands and hearts. They had built it out of love and desperation in the heart of the storm, and it had held. Whatever came next, shelters, uncertainty, a new and unfamiliar life, they would face it from within these walls. Outside, the great pump continued its work, its monstrous heartbeat no longer a sound of terror, but a promise. It was the sound of a world, broken but not dead, slowly, deliberately, beginning to put itself back together. And in the dim, swaying belly of the truck, David Miller, the architect, closed his eyes and allowed himself, finally, to rest. Here is a short outro for the story. The story of the Miller family is a powerful reminder that even when the fiercest storms of life rage around us, and the walls we build with our own hands come crashing down, there is a fortress that cannot be shaken. In their moment of ultimate despair, their prayer became a shield, and faith lit a candle in the darkest night. Thank you for listening to this story of hope and divine intervention. If you were moved by the miracle that protected this family, please subscribe to our channel, Prayer Miracles, for more incredible true stories that testify to the power of faith. Like and share this video, and may you always find your shelter in the storm.